So imagine sitting in this dusty, super rural Punjabi village back in the late 19th century.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Right. And you're just sitting there listening to a minor court clerk calmly explain to people that he is simultaneously of Persian royal descent, the fulfillment of some medieval prophecy by a Chinese mystic, and a direct blood descendant of the Prophet of Islam.
I mean, on its face, it just sounds utterly absurd.
That's completely. It's this dizzying carousel of contradictory identities. Like in any normal situation, that should invite immediate ridicule.
Yeah, you'd think people would just laugh him out of the room.
Exactly. But what if a highly influential, deeply organized body of Orthodox critics came along and claimed that this, shifting identity wasn't just some localized megalomania?
Right, what if it was something bigger?
Yeah. What if they argued it was actually the carefully engineered linchpin of a British colonial psychological operation?
Wow.
Like a psyop specifically designed to just break the back of armed resistance in the Indian subcontinent.
Which instantly transforms a localized theological dispute into this massive, tense geopolitical thriller.
It really does.
Yeah.
And welcome to the deep dive, by the way, because that is exactly our mission for today. We are unpacking a stack of highly specific, extremely orthodox historical texts that detail the 19th century origins of a movement.
Right, a movement known in these particular sources as the Qadiyani.
Yes, though you listening might actually be more familiar with it as the Ahmadiyya movement, founded by Mirza Ghulam Ahmed.
And before we really pull the thread on this historical tapestry, there is a crucial, totally non-negotiable disclaimer we need to establish with you.
Oh, absolutely. The tone and the intent of this source material kind of demand it, because these texts are, well, they're entirely polemical. Ferociously. So I want to explicitly note right at the top that the sources we're dissecting today are written from a fiercely critical traditionalist standpoint.
Right. They use incredibly strong language.
Yes, strong polemical language. They hurl very serious political accusations and honestly profound theological indictments.
Which means our goal today is absolutely not to endorse them.
No, not at all. We are not validating or agreeing with the viewpoints, the sides, or, the insults contained in these texts.
We are just impartial analytical mirrors today.
Exactly. We're looking at the architecture of the argument. We just want to impartially dissect what these specific sources argue, giving you a clear understanding of how this orthodox narrative actually constructs its critique of the movement's early days.
Because the analytical value here really lies in observing the mechanics of the critique itself.
Right.
By doing that, we get an unparalleled view into the anxieties, the defense mechanisms, and the strategic thinking of the Orthodox establishment during, well, one of the most volatile periods of colonial history.
And to do that effectively, we're setting a very strict scope today.
Right, we're focusing on a specific chunk of the material.
Exactly. We're focusing exclusively on the foundational elements presented at the very beginning of the sources. Basically, just the first 16 or 17% of this massive textual history.
Just the absolute origins.
Yeah. So we'll explore the geopolitical context of 19th century India, the stated reasons the authors give for the movement's rise, and the deeply scrutinized early life of its founder.
Including those contradictory lineage claims you mentioned earlier.
Right, exactly. We are examining the Genesis story strictly as told by its fiercest critics.
And what's fascinating here is that the Genesis story in these texts doesn't actually begin with a man meditating in a cave or receiving some divine revelation.
It doesn't.
It begins with the catastrophic fracture of 1857.
Right, the mutiny or the First War of Independence, depending on the historical framing. We're assuming you are already somewhat familiar with the seismic impact of 1857.
Yeah, the complete British takeover of India and the final formal collapse of the major Islamic state that had existed there since the early 16th century.
But the thing is, the source texts don't just treat 1857 as a random date on a timeline. They treat it as the psychological and political bedrock for literally everything that follows.
Right. The authors make a real point to emphasize that the collapse of the state didn't mean the capitulation of the people.
At all. The narrative they construct is this image of an unyielding, practically ungovernable Muslim populace.
They argue that losing that political umbrella actually just intensified the grassroots resistance.
Yeah, the sources claim that Muslims continuously led rebellions. They organized these intricate internal underground movements, and they engaged in relentless armed resistance.
Which the text formally refers to as jihad.
Exactly. And they were demanding nothing less than the total expulsion of the colonizers.
So the text sets up this scenario where the British military machine, despite its overwhelming technological and logistical superiority, basically hits a brick wall.
Right, and according to the author, the colonial administration had to sit down and fundamentally analyze the psychology of this resistance.
Because bullets weren't working.
No, they weren't. The text claims the British recognized that the nature of the Muslim populace was fundamentally, inherently religious.
Right. The exact framing in the source is that the British realized religion is what moves them, and religion is what pacifies them.
Which is such a striking psychological assessment to attribute to an empire.
It really is. The colonial strategists allegedly concluded that physical coercion was just demonstrating diminishing returns. You know, you can dismantle an army, but you can't really shoot an ideology.
Right, you can't put a bullet in a belief system.
Exactly. So the source claims the British realized they needed to achieve cognitive and spiritual control. And to do that, they needed a local proxy.
A religious figure of high stature?
Right, someone who could organically gather the masses around him, command their spiritual loyalty, and then basically smoothly redirect that loyalty to serve British interests.
And the source claims they found their absolute perfect proxy in Mirza Ghulam Ahmed.
Yes, that is the core of their historical thesis.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the text is framing the entire genesis of a really massive religious movement as a calculated, top-down geopolitical psyop.
Right, it reads almost like a boardroom conspiracy.
Yeah, like British administrators just pressed a button to invent a theology. So I have to ask, isn't that framing incredibly reductive? I mean, how common or effective is it historically for an occupying empire to attempt to artificially manufacture and co-opt local theology to this extent?
Well, the historical reality of empires utilizing religious figures is definitely well documented. But what's fascinating here is the actual function of this specific narrative for the Orthodox author.
What do you mean by function?
Well, the traditionalist writer is wrestling with this agonizing reality of a pacified population, right?
Yeah, they lost the resistance.
Exactly. By framing the movement purely as a colonial invention, the author strategically delegitimizes the new theology by anchoring it to treason.
Oh, wow. So it completely bypasses the theological debate entirely.
Exactly. If the founder is fundamentally a British asset, you don't even need to argue about scripture with him.
That is rhetorical brilliance on the part of the text.
It really is.
Yeah.
It neutralizes the movement's spiritual claims by exposing an alleged material origin. The author is basically communicating to the Orthodox community that their anti-colonial resistance didn't fail because Orthodox theology was weak.
Right.
And it didn't fail because the British military was just overwhelmingly superior.
It failed because authentic Islamic resistance was sabotaged from within.
Yes, through the weaponization of doctrine. It preserves the honor of the Orthodox resistance while concentrating all the historical blame onto this new movement.
That makes total sense from a narrative warfare perspective. But, okay, if we accept the author's premise that the British had the motive to deploy a theological proxy, a boardroom strategy is still pretty useless without the actual sociological conditions to make it grow.
Well,
right?
Absolutely. You can't just plant a completely fabricated religion in hostile soil and expect it to thrive.
Right. So how does the source explain the actual mechanics of the movement taking root? Because surely the author knows you need more than just British funding.
And the text actually addresses exactly that. It pivots from the geopolitical motive to the microsociological environment. It details this perfect storm of conditions.
A perfect storm. Okay, let's hear it.
The author constructs a web of 4 intersecting vulnerabilities that made the Indian subcontinent uniquely susceptible.
Let's weave those conditions together then, because the text starts with the environment itself, right? It describes the nature of India as a region historically steeped in esoteric movements and ignorance.
Yeah, and there's a really fascinating inclusion in the text here from a figure named Masood Nadwi.
Right. He describes India as a place where people worship 30 million deities.
Yes. And the inclusion of that specific phrase, 30 million deities, is a highly calculated rhetorical device.
How so?
Well, the author is drawing a really sharp contrast between the strict, unyielding monotheism of traditional Islam and the vast syncretic multi-deity landscape of the subcontinent. The argument being made is that the intellectual and spiritual borders of Orthodox monotheism in India were just constantly subjected to a kind of syncretic gravity.
Like the culture around it was constantly pulling at the edges of the theology.
Exactly. It's an environment where the boundaries were uniquely vulnerable to being blurred.
So it's basically the tinder waiting for a spark. The author suggests that in a place where theological boundaries are already a bit porous, a movement introducing new claims to prophecy faces significantly less intellectual friction.
Right, way less friction than it would in a rigidly homogeneous Orthodox center somewhere else.
Okay, so that's the environmental vulnerability. That's pillar one. What's the second pillar?
The text immediately pairs this environmental vulnerability with the active catalyst of British sponsorship.
Ah, right. The colonial government actually pushing people into the fold.
Yeah, the author claims the government provided overt and covert institutional backing, basically acting as the bellows fanning the flame.
Because state power tips the scales. If you join the movement, maybe you get administrative favor or protection.
Exactly. So you have the tinder of the syncretic environment and the bellows of colonial sponsorship.
Which brings us to the third pillar, the spark itself. According to the text, the spark is the founder's personality.
Right. The text spends a lot of time diagnosing Mirza Ghulam Ahmed with this abnormal, deeply ambitious personality.
Yeah, it describes a man just consumed by a craving for fame. Someone who wanted historical glory comparable to the Prophet of Islam.
The psychological profiling here is really essential to the author's narrative, because the British supposedly needed a highly specific psychological profile.
Someone arrogant enough to claim divine authority, but malleable enough to take orders.
Exactly. Malleable enough to align that spiritual authority with colonial objectives. Yeah. The author is constructing this symbiotic, almost parasitic relationship between the empire's need for pacification and the founder's need for adulation.
Wow. Okay, so we have the environment, the empire, and the ambitious founder. That's three. But the final condition the author outlines, this is where it gets really interesting to me. Because it isn't an external attack at all. It's actually an internal indictment.
Yes. This is a crucial pivot in the text.
The text explicitly cites the neglect of traditional Muslims as the fourth primary reason for the movement's success.
The text pulls absolutely no punches against its own demographic.
It really doesn't. The author flat out states that mainstream Muslims completely failed to actively preach and defend their faith.
Right, they allowed superstitions to spread.
Yeah, they left their own rural followers intellectually defenseless against this ideological invasion. It honestly reminds me of a sports coach giving a fiery press conference after a devastating loss.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Right, like the coach blames the opposing team for cheating. He blames the referees for being bought out by the league. But then at the very end of the rant, he just sighs and admits, oh, in our own defense, completely fell asleep on the field.
The sports coach analogy perfectly captures the dual nature of this polemic. Because while the text functions as a blistering external attack on the movement, it is simultaneously an urgent, really harsh internal wake-up call to the Orthodox establishment.
It's confronting the traditionalists with the consequences of their own complacency.
Exactly. It implies that the British plot and the founders' megalomania would have fundamentally failed if the Orthodox scholars had just been doing their jobs.
They left the door wide open.
They did. And the author makes the threat of the movement feel incredibly visceral by framing it this way. It's portrayed as an ideological virus that only took hold because the Orthodox immune system was severely compromised by neglect.
So it's not just a history lesson. It's demanding that the reader radically recommit to Orthodox education and vigilance right now.
Yes, exactly.
And this internal indictment seamlessly transitions into what I can only really describe as the prosecutor's final charges.
The 5 objectives.
Right. Having established how the movement supposedly infiltrated this weakened Orthodox immune system, the source lays out 5 core objectives that the movement set out to achieve. But when I was looking at these, I was struck by how secular they are.
What do you mean by secular?
Well, almost none of them are about theology. They are entirely about control, loyalty, and military pacification. They read like a colonial military strategy rather than a religious creed. Why does the source focus so heavily on geopolitical implications rather than strictly theological disputes here?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the distinction between theology and military strategy in 19th century colonial India was virtually non-existent for the occupied population. When we examine these 5 objectives, we're looking at the exact intersection where doctrine literally dictates political reality.
Okay, let's look at the literal indictment from the source then. Objective 1, to serve colonial objectives.
Straightforward.
Right. Objective 2, to turn Muslims away from their religion or weaken their ideological resolve.
Also clear.
Objective 3, to force Muslims to become attached to and subservient to the British. Objective 4, to dismantle the bonds of Islamic brotherhood and destroy the theological concept of al-wala wal-bara.
That one is massive.
Yeah. And finally, Objective 5, to explicitly abolish the religious duty of armed jihad, which the author claims was actually on the verge of toppling the British.
Objectives 4 and 5 are the absolute core of the Orthodox anxiety here.
Let's dig into Objective 4 then. The concept of al-wala wal-bara. I know that translates roughly to loyalty to believers and disavowal of non-believers, but how does that function sociologically?
It requires a deep dive to understand its function, especially under occupation. In Islamic theology, this concept isn't just a warm spiritual feeling of brotherhood. It is the sociological border wall of the community.
Okay, the border wall. So it's the mechanism that prevents assimilation.
Precisely. It dictates social cohesion, it dictates economic cooperation, and crucial here, political allegiance. It means that your ultimate loyalty belongs exclusively to the community of believers. And you must actively disavow the systems, the authority, and the legitimacy of the non-believing occupying force.
So by claiming the movement sought to destroy this specific concept, the author is accusing them of attempting to dissolve the socio-political glue that kept the resistance intact.
Exactly. Because if you convince a population that God actually wants them to be loyal to the British Crown, you haven't just changed their theology.
You've actively drafted them into the colonial administrative apparatus.
Yes. The psychological wall falls, and physical assimilation just naturally follows.
Which culminates directly in the 5th objective.
Yeah.
The formal abolition of armed jihad.
And the author views this as the ultimate delivery mechanism for the British strategy.
Because a military decree banning resistance just makes people mad, right?
Exactly. A decree from a British general banning resistance only breeds more resentment and more violence. But a theological decree from a supposedly divine local leader banning resistance, that rewires the population's entire moral compass.
It frames fighting the British not as heroism, but as a sin against God.
Yes. The author is arguing that the theology is merely the delivery mechanism for political subjugation.
It's ideological laundering.
That's a great way to put it.
The colonial administration's need for pacification is laundered through the founders' claims of divine inspiration. And the result is a population that willingly disarms itself.
Because the traditionalist worldview cannot separate the spiritual from the political. For the author, altering the doctrine of jihad isn't just a nuanced academic debate about the conditions of warfare in the modern age.
No.
It is an existential threat to the physical survival of the Muslim identity in India.
And this brings us directly to the architect of this alleged laundering, the founder himself. The text shifts its focus from the macro strategy right down to the micro-level origins of Mirza Ghulam Ahmed.
And the way the text attacks his credibility is fascinating, particularly how it focuses heavily on his lineage.
Yes, the enigma of the shifting lineage. Because, you would expect a religious leader to have a very clear, unassailable origin story. But the text portrays this dizzying, utterly contradictory web of ancestral claims.
And we have to remember, genealogy in traditional Islamic scholarship is the bedrock of credibility.
Right. It establishes who you are.
It establishes your historical continuity and, crucially, your right to speak on matters of authority. So the author absolutely weaponizes the founder's own varying claims against him.
The source notes that his baseline lineage, like his actual historical family tree, traces back through his father, Mirza Ghulam Murtaza, all the way to a man named Mirza Hadi Beg.
Okay.
But then the text launches into this harsh critique of how the founder constantly rewrote this ancestry over time. Allegedly, he first claimed his family was originally Mughal, specifically from the prestigious Barlas branch.
Right, tapping into the old ruling class.
Exactly. But later, the claim shifted to Persian heritage.
Okay, shifting gears.
Then, the text asserts he claimed to actually be of Chinese origin. I know. At another juncture, he announced he was a direct descendant of the Prophet's daughter, Fatima.
Claiming prophetic bloodlines now.
And he even traced his lineage back to the biblical patriarchs, Isaac and Ishmael.
That is just a spectacular array of ancestral identities. I mean,
Yeah.
You're spanning East Asia, the Persian Empire, the ruling Indian dynasty, and the absolute core of Arab prophetic nobility.
Right. So put yourself in the position of an observer in the 19th century. If a man stands up in the town square and claims to be Mughal on Monday, Persian on Wednesday, and a direct descendant of the Prophet on Friday, Doesn't that invite immediate, devastating skepticism?
You'd think so.
It seems like a fundamentally flawed strategy. It's like someone constantly rewriting their resume depending on who they're talking to. Wouldn't that instantly destroy his credibility with any rational audience?
Well, it absolutely invites skepticism from the Orthodox gatekeepers, which is exactly why this text highlights it so prominently as empirical proof of deception.
Right, they use it as a weapon.
But if we analyze the strategy through the lens of charismatic authority building, a different logic actually emerges.
Okay, explain that logic.
The founder is casting what we might call a charismatic net. A universal movement essentially requires universal roots.
Oh, wow. Okay, I see where you're going with this.
Right. If you claim Mughal royalty, you tap into the nostalgia and the loyalty of those mourning the lost Indian Empire.
Makes sense.
If you claim Persian heritage, you align yourself with high intellectual and literary culture.
Right.
And if you claim prophetic bloodlines, you bypass temporal authority entirely and claim the absolute highest tier of Islamic spiritual legitimacy.
So by laying claim to all of them, he theoretically creates entry points for wildly diverse cultural and religious demographics.
Exactly, the mechanism at play.
But how does he counter the obvious empirical pushback? Because people had to be pointing out the historical contradictions, right? How does he defend it?
The text includes a highly specific detail about exactly this. The author claims the founder justified these massive shifts by asserting that God was actively revealing the quote-unquote true nature of his family to him through ongoing inspiration.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The text quotes him saying, "No one knows the truths of families like God Almighty knows them."
That is an incredibly potent, almost impenetrable rhetorical shield. He's elevating his genealogy from a matter of empirical historical record to a matter of divine revelation.
Exactly, because you cannot fact-check a direct line to God with a birth certificate.
You really can't.
If his lineage is subject to progressive spiritual unfolding, then inconsistency isn't evidence of a lie, right? It's evidence of continuous divine communication.
That's whack.
And the author of our source deeply understands the danger of this tactic. The text highlights it to expose what the Orthodox view as a deeply manipulative strategy, just bending reality, history, and scripture to suit an immediate opportunistic need for authority.
And the text gives a fascinating example of how he supposedly manipulated existing esoteric literature to back up these shifting claims.
Right, the Ibn Arabi connection.
Yes. The source asserts he specifically referenced a famous text by the medieval Andalusian mystic Ibn Arabi called Fusus al-Hikam.
A very heavy, complex, mystical text.
Exactly. And in this book, Ibn Arabi allegedly prophesied a boy born in the last days who would be of Chinese origin.
Okay.
And the founder, according to the text, actively used this specific obscure prophecy to justify his sudden claim of Chinese lineage. He just declared himself the intended subject of that prophecy.
The tactical deployment of Ibn Arabi is really significant here, because Ibn Arabi is a giant in the esoteric and mystical traditions of Islam.
Right, he carries a lot of weight.
Huge weight.
Yeah.
By tethering his shifting lineage to respected, albeit highly complex and contested mystical prophecies, the founder attempts to anchor his new claims in established classical scholarship.
He's borrowing their credibility?
Yes, and the Orthodox author points this out to demonstrate what they see as a cynical, calculated scavenging of classical texts to engineer legitimacy.
Scavenging classical texts, that's a great phrase. And having thoroughly attacked his lofty claims of royal and prophetic blood, the author doesn't stop there, do they?
No, they do not.
The text executes this deliberate, rapid descent from the heights of divine prophecy straight down into the grimy, mundane reality of his actual documented early life.
The contrast is jarring and clearly very intentional.
Extremely intentional. The deliberate juxtaposition of grand spiritual claims against deeply unimpressive material origins is just a classic deconstruction technique in polemics.
Great, you bring them back down to earth.
Literally. The source grounds him geographically in Qadiyani, which was a small town in the Punjab, born around 1839 or 1840. And the text absolutely relishes in quoting the founder's own disparaging descriptions of his hometown.
Oh, the quotes are brutal.
They are. He supposedly characterized it as a place further than a car can reach, noting that blessings were few.
And then the line about the inhabitants.
Yes. Most brutally, he allegedly described the inhabitants of his own village as being like cattle who knew absolutely nothing of Islam or the Quran.
The author's reaction to this quote in the text is a masterstroke of rhetorical insult.
It really is. The author basically says, well, we finally agree on something.
Right.
The text mockingly concurs with the founder's assessment, arguing that only among a populace so profoundly ignorant, a population like cattle, could someone dare to claim prophecy and actually find a receptive audience.
It manages to insult the founder's origins while simultaneously invalidating the intellectual capacity of his entire early follower base.
It's a 2-for-1 insult.
Exactly. And then the text applies the strict Orthodox credentialing system to his early education, which in traditional Islam is known as the sanad, or the chain of transmission.
Right. We've talked about the sanad before.
Yeah. In the Orthodox framework, who you study with, the rigor of the curriculum and the moral uprightness of your teachers are the absolute non-negotiable prerequisites for any claim to religious authority.
And according to the source, his sanad is practically non-existent.
It's abysmal, according to the text.
His education is described as just basic grammar, Arabic, Persian, and some medicine taught by his father. And the author makes sure to derisively label his father not just as a doctor, but as a soothsayer.
Which automatically discredits the religious validity of the household.
Right. But the most aggressive attack on his credentialing comes when the text claims, allegedly quoting the founder's own son, that some of his early teachers were habitual users of hashish and opium.
Yeah, that's a heavy accusation. And in the traditionalist framework, the moral character, the adab, of the teacher is considered to be transferred to the student.
Ah, so the character flows down the chain.
Exactly. By introducing the detail about narcotics, the author instantly shatters any illusion of spiritual purity or rigorous scholarly transmission. It completely invalidates his intellectual lineage before he even makes a religious claim.
That is devastating in that context. And the text follows this by meticulously detailing his professional failures as well.
Oh yeah, they list everything.
He fails a law exam. He takes basic English classes at a night school. He secures a job as a minor court clerk in the city of Sialkot, where he earns a meager salary of 15 rupees a month from 1864 to 1868.
We are essentially given the biography of a struggling, desperately mundane, low-level colonial bureaucrat.
Right. So what does this all mean? The author spends a lot of time highlighting the low salary, the failed exams, the alleged drug-using teachers. It feels like simple character assassination, but is there a deeper theological argument the author is making by focusing on these mundane failures?
This raises an important question because the accumulation of these highly specific, deeply mundane details actually serves a vital structural purpose for the author's overall argument.
Okay, what's the structural purpose?
It builds to a crescendo of materialist critique. The author takes his era of obscurity, the failed exams, the 15-rupee salary, the drug-addled tutors, and slams it directly against quotes from the founder detailing his later life.
Ah, the contrast of later wealth.
Yes. The text quotes the founder marveling at his subsequent success, describing how armies of seekers eventually came to him, bringing wealth and gifts like a raging sea, until his house was physically too small to contain all the incoming capital.
Like a raging sea, that is quite the visual.
It is. By establishing the desperate poverty and professional failure of his youth and contrasting it with the raging sea of subsequent wealth, the author makes their final, really devastating argument.
They're stripping away the aura of divine election.
Systematically stripping it away, yes.
It reframes the entire genesis of the movement. It posits that this was never about theological revival at all. It reduces the claim of profound divine revelation to a highly successful British-sponsored business model.
A lucrative grift.
Exactly. A lucrative grift built on the ignorance of villagers and the geopolitical desperation of a colonial empire, executed by a failed legal clerk who finally found a way to get rich.
It is the ultimate materialist deconstruction of a spiritual narrative, and it perfectly closes the loop that the author opened with the British boardroom strategy right after 1857.
Wow. It really brings it all full circle. And that masterful, aggressive looping brings us to the end of our specific scope for today's deep dive.
Right, we've covered the foundational elements.
We really have. We set out to examine the foundational architecture of these Orthodox sources, basically just that first 16%, to understand exactly how they construct their reality and delegitimize their opposition.
And we've traced the narrative from the massive psychological trauma and geopolitical fracture of 1857.
Right, through the sociological tinderbox of a syncretic India.
Down to the shifting lineages and the 15-rupee salary of a rural clerk.
It's been a journey. We've witnessed an absolute masterclass in polemical framing. It demonstrates how Orthodox scholars braided history, theology, sociological vulnerability, and character assassination together to build this impenetrable narrative against what they viewed as an existential, colonial-backed threat.
It's a profound reminder of the power of historical framing.
It really is. And it leaves you, the listener, with a complex mechanism to mull over. We've spent this time dissecting how these 19th century sources viewed the overt manipulation of religion for colonial control.
Right, the idea that an occupying empire would actively sponsor, or at least heavily nurture, a theological movement to pacify a population and fundamentally rewrite their socio-political loyalties.
Which forces you to look at the world today, right? With our interconnected, highly polarized societies, and ask a deeply uncomfortable question.
Always the goal.
If empires in the 1800s allegedly recognized that the most effective way to neutralize resistance was to co-opt the underlying ideology, to launder their geopolitical goals through charismatic proxies and shifting narratives, how might modern geopolitical powers be attempting to sponsor or co-opt ideological, cultural, or social movements today?
It's a chilling thought.
Are the mechanisms of ideological pacification really any different now, or have the boardroom strategies simply gone digital, replacing the colonial administrators with algorithms and the rural clerks with influencers?
Something to think about the next time you scroll through a movement online.
Exactly. When you look at the movements shaping our world today, it makes you wonder, are we still just arguing passionately about the theology while someone entirely unseen is holding the reins? Keep questioning the underlying mechanics of the historical and modern narratives you consume. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll catch you next time.
Welcome back to another deep dive.
Yeah, glad to be here.
So we always say this is for you, the learner, because you want the full story, without getting bogged down or overwhelmed.
Exactly, just getting right to the core of it.
Right. And today's topic is, well, I kind of like to think of it as the ultimate 19th century Kickstarter campaign, but with a massive theological twist.
That is a very good way to put it, actually.
Yeah, because we are unpacking the psychological and strategic evolution of Mirza Ghulam Ahmed in 19th century colonial India.
It is a fascinating journey, just looking at how one guy operates in that specific environment.
Our mission today is basically to figure out exactly how a man transitioned from, being an unemployed local resident, writing religious pamphlets.
Just churning out basic flyers, yeah.
Right, into the absolute unquestioned leader of a movement, claiming titles from the Mahdi to the Messiah.
And even Krishna later on.
Which is wild. Really quick disclaimer before we jump in. Our goal here is strictly neutral. We are not endorsing, validating, or invalidating any religious or political viewpoints today.
Right. We are just historians today.
Exactly. We are strictly analyzing the historical events, the claims, and the methodologies as they are documented in our source material. So let's unpack this.
Where do you want to start?
Let's start with the business of debate. Because after he left his job at a courthouse in Sialkot, Ghulam Ahmed is basically unemployed, right?
He is. He goes back to his family's village in Punjab, Qadiyani, and he's sitting there unemployed, but he's paying very close attention to the world around him.
And the socioeconomic environment in India at that time was just, it was a pressure cooker.
Oh, absolutely. If we connect this to the bigger picture, you have to remember the Great Rebellion of 1857 had just happened.
Right, the Sepoy Mutiny.
Exactly. And the British completely crushed it. They dissolved the Mughal Empire entirely. So the Muslim elite and middle class overnight lose their centuries-long political dominance.
That is a massive psychological trauma for a whole population.
It's devastating. Their economic standing is gutted, their pride is wounded, and under colonial rule, when you can't fight on a political battlefield.
Because the British have a monopoly on the military, right?
Exactly. So religious identity becomes the primary battleground. Defending the faith wasn't just about theology anymore.
It was about community pride.
Right. And the British actually encouraged these public religious debates. It kept the Hindu revivalists, the Christian missionaries, and the Muslim scholars arguing with each other instead of uniting against the crown.
Divide and conquer.
Classic colonial strategy. But what it meant for an unemployed clerk like Ghulam Ahmed was that there was a massive market demand.
It's like someone finding a lucrative niche in the modern creator economy, right?
Yeah.
He saw where the engagement and the funding were, and he pivoted.
He absolutely did. The Muslim community was feeling defensive, and they desperately needed champions to defend them in these town squares, so they were heavily funding anyone who could argue well.
So he starts writing flyers, articles, defending mainstream Islam.
Yes. And his initial approach was entirely orthodox. No fringe ideas at all.
Why do you think he played it so safe at first?
Well, you have to build trust. It's like building a loyal customer base before you introduce a controversial new product.
Ah, right. He needed the social proof.
Exactly. He became their fierce, articulate defender. And because of that, he secured financial backing from the wealthy elite. The community became incredibly emotionally invested in him.
Which sets up the perfect trap for his next big move, the Barahin Ahmadiyya.
Yes, his magnum opus, or so he claimed.
So he crowdfunds this massive project. He promises his backers this book will span 50 volumes. 50.
Containing 300 undeniable proofs of Islam, refuting all other religions.
So people pre-order, they throw money at him. And he writes volume 1, volume 2, 3, 4, and he just stops at volume 5.
It just stops.
And when the donors show up, furious, demanding their money back for the missing 45 volumes, he gives this incredible excuse.
It is notoriously bold.
He basically tells them, look, I intended to write 50, but the only difference between the number 5 and the number 50 is a 0.
Right.
And a 0 means nothing. So mathematically, I have fulfilled my promise, and you get no refunds.
It's insulting to basic logic, honestly.
Wait, he literally told angry financial backers that a 0 means nothing. Wasn't this viewed as blatant fraud? How did he survive the backlash?
Well, to understand that, we have to look at what was actually in those first 5 volumes. Because it wasn't the external logical proofs they paid for.
What do you write about?
Mostly self-praise. He filled those pages with claims of his own divine dreams, his personal miracles, and a huge amount of flattery directed at the British government.
Wait, flattery?
Oh, yes. Proclaiming absolute loyalty to the crown and forbidding armed struggle against them.
So he basically handed them his personal diary and a mandate to submit to the colonizers. That's the opposite of what they funded.
Exactly. But here is where the psychology of the sunk cost fallacy kicks in.
Okay, lay that out for me.
These followers had invested heavily in him, not just money, but their social reputation. They had touted him as their great champion to all their rivals.
Oh, I see.
So if they admit they were conned by a guy doing bad wordplay with the number 0...
They look like total fools.
Right. It was cognitively too difficult to admit that profound humiliation. So instead of turning on him, they rationalized it. They convinced themselves that the spiritual wisdom in those 5 volumes was worth the price of 50.
Wow. They shifted the goalposts in their own minds to protect their egos.
Yes, and he leaned into that.
Yeah.
Which brings us to a massive shift. He starts blurring the lines of his authority.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because he's not just a scholar anymore. He starts claiming he receives ilham, divine inspiration.
This is the load-bearing pillar of his entire movement.
Right, because claiming esoteric, hidden knowledge is he effectively immunizing himself against normal scholarly criticism.
100%. In traditional Islamic theology, there is a hard line between Wahweh, which is direct prophetic revelation that ended with Muhammad, and ilham, which is just a general, soft, spiritual intuition.
Like having a really profound dream.
Exactly. It has no authority over anyone else. But Ghulam Ahmed starts using the word ilham to describe things that sound exactly like prophetic Wahweh.
He's hacking the theology.
He really is. He engaged in textual manipulation. He started producing Arabic text that mimicked the unique style and majestic rhythm of the Quran itself.
So he's sounding like scripture.
Worse. He would take actual Quranic verses that were originally directed at ancient prophets, and he would splice his own name into them.
Wait, really? Like replacing Abraham's name with his own?
Yes, to project this undeniable divine aura. And by claiming direct divine communication, he shifts the entire debate.
Because it's no longer about whether his arguments make logical sense.
Right. It becomes a test of the follower's spiritual purity. If you disagree with him on a point of history or logic, you aren't arguing with Mirza Ghulam Ahmed anymore. You are supposedly arguing with the divine.
And you can't win an argument with God. That's a brilliant way to shut down your critics.
It completely short-circuits critical thinking.
And once he has that insulation, he just starts escalating, doesn't he?
Oh, rapidly. The ambition is boundless. First, he claims to be the promised Mahdi.
Which is the reformer figure expected in the 14th Islamic century, right?
Yes. And while that's a big claim, it's not entirely unprecedented in the region. But then he goes for the ultimate title, the Messiah, Jesus.
Okay, but there's a huge logistical problem there. The established narrative in Islam and Christianity is that Jesus is going to physically descend from heaven. Ghulam Ahmed is a guy from Punjab. He cannot drop out of the sky.
Right, so he has to create a vacancy for the job. He has to rewrite the established narratives.
How does he do that?
He starts aggressively claiming that Jesus did not ascend to heaven. He says Jesus survived the crucifixion, fled all the way to Kashmir in India, lived a long life, died, and was buried there in a specific tomb, the tomb of Uz Asaf.
That is just, it's a breathtaking historical rewrite.
But structurally, it solves his problem. If Jesus is physically dead and buried in Kashmir, he can never physically return.
Which means the prophecy of his return has to be a metaphor.
Exactly. He argued the return of the Messiah meant the spirit and power of Jesus transferring into a modern man.
And shocker, that man happens to be him.
What's fascinating here is the psychology of escalating claims. You'd think adding all these crazy titles would make people leave.
Yeah, especially because he didn't stop at Jesus. He also claimed to be the Hindu avatar Krishna, right?
He did, to appeal to the Hindu population.
It's literally like a corporate merger of religions. He's trying to acquire the followers of Islam, Christianity, and Hinduism all at once by adopting the titles of their central figures.
That's a great analogy. And the reason his core followers didn't leave is because once a group accepts a radical premise, like that zero excuse or the divine ilm, the leader has to keep testing the boundaries.
Routine gets boring.
Exactly. They need that constant adrenaline of new, exclusive revelations.
But the theology gets so messy. Which brings us to the most bizarre part of our research for this deep dive, the metaphor of the spiritual pregnancy.
Yes. The Son of Mary paradox.
Okay, so, to claim the title of the Messiah, he has to fulfill the prophecy of being the son of Mary. But his mother wasn't Mary.
Right, his parents were just local landowners.
So how does he explain this? The sources outline this highly convoluted metaphor.
It's incredibly literalized. He claimed that God called him Mary in a revelation, and so he spent 2 years developing these Marian qualities: purity, devotion, withdrawal.
So he's spiritually acting as Mary.
Right. And then he claims the spirit of Jesus was breathed into him, causing him to become, in his own words, spiritually pregnant for 10 months.
Wait, he essentially claimed to be his own mother.
He did. After the 10 months, he claimed he metaphorically gave birth to himself as Jesus, fulfilling the title Son of Mary.
This raises a massive red flag for me. How does any rational follower rationalize such an absurd narrative? I mean, why would he make it so confusing?
Well, this delves right into the mechanics of cultic logic.
Okay, unpack that.
Paradoxically, the more bizarre and complex a doctrine is, the more effectively it binds the followers to the leader.
Because it forces them to invest even more cognitive energy.
Yes, and it requires them to completely suspend their critical thinking. If the theology was simple, you could debate it. But the spiritual pregnancy metaphor is so out there, no one else in the world will validate it.
So if you believe it, you are completely isolated.
Exactly. You have to rely entirely on his exclusive, esoteric interpretation of reality. Mainstream society will look at you like you're crazy, which just reinforces his narrative that only we have the hidden truth.
It's an intentional filter. He's building a wall around his community. But going from a guy selling books to a man demanding people believe he gave birth to himself, he had to have help, right?
Absolutely. No leader does this in a vacuum. You need an enabler.
And for him, this was his close friend, Hakim Nuruddin.
Yes. Nuruddin was a highly respected Orthodox scholar, a royal physician. He had massive social capital.
So what does this all mean? How critical was Nuruddin in turning these wild theories into an actual structured organization?
He was indispensable. Nuruddin provided the intellectual cover. When Ghulam Ahmed made a wild claim, Nuruddin would write dense books validating him, using his own pristine reputation to shield his friend.
He was the ultimate validator.
Right, and Nuruddin helped push for the ultimate lock-in mechanism. In 1889, they formalized the movement with the Bay'ah.
The Oath of Allegiance.
Yes, and this wasn't just joining a club. This oath required followers to swear absolute obedience to Ghulam Ahmed in all things.
Placing him above their own families, right?
Above family friendships, worldly ties, everything.
So it's the transition from an ideology you can debate into a rigid organizational structure.
Exactly. The Bay'ah signaled the end of intellectual debate. Belonging to the group now meant total surrender to his person. It isolated the followers from outside influences and solidified his absolute control.
It's just incredible. If we step back and look at the whole picture, the journey covered in this deep dive is staggering.
It really is a masterclass in manipulation.
We watched an unemployed debater use crowdfunding, basically con his investors with a math joke, redefine religious language to avoid critique, and escalate his titles from a scholar all the way to the Messiah and Krishna.
Using incredibly bizarre metaphors like the spiritual pregnancy along the way.
And finally, locking his followers into an oath of absolute submission. And, while this is a specific 19th century historical case, I want you, the listener, to think about how relevant this is today.
Oh, it's incredibly relevant.
Because the tactics shifting goalposts, claiming exclusive esoteric truth, demanding isolation from outside critique, we see these exact same mechanics in modern movements.
In extreme internet communities, modern cults, even startup culture sometimes.
Right. The human vulnerabilities are exactly the same. Which leaves us with a final, lingering question for you to mull over.
I like this one.
If someone today used this exact same playbook, crowdfunding a massive project, failing to deliver by claiming a zero means nothing, and then claiming a special unquestionable status to avoid accountability, how quickly would they be exposed by the internet?
You'd think immediately, right?
You would think so. But would they? Or would the algorithms, the echo chambers, and the hyperconnectivity of the web actually allow them to find their susceptible audience instantly and successfully build an even larger, more insulated modern movement?
Scary thought.
It is. Think about that the next time someone asks you to ignore basic logic for their exclusive truth. We'll see you on the next deep dive.
When we look at a towering religious figure, like a prophet or a messiah or a saint. Wait, strike that. I shouldn't use ellipses. When we look at someone who claims to hold the very keys to the universe, there's this deeply ingrained cultural expectation of divine isolation.
Right, yeah. Like they're above it all.
Exactly. We picture them standing on a remote, windswept mountaintop, right? Completely detached from the messy, corrupt, highly transactional world of human politics.
Absolutely. We expect them to just be up there, receiving pure, unfiltered lightning from the heavens.
Yeah, untethered from the grim realities of whoever happens to be sitting on the local throne.
Right. We inherently expect the divine to be above the fray. It's that classic ascetic archetype.
Right. The figure who fundamentally rejects worldly power.
Exactly, because they are operating on a cosmic timescale. I mean, the very idea of a prophet deeply concerned with the bureaucratic paperwork of a colonial empire, it feels completely antithetical to our understanding of spiritual awakening.
It totally does. It feels like a contradiction in terms. The spiritual realm is supposed to be, clean.
Clean and separate, yeah.
But then you pull back the curtain on the 19th century in colonial India, and suddenly that pristine, isolated mountaintop is it's absolutely buried under piles of British imperial paperwork.
Oh, buried is the right word. It's staggering.
You expect to find a solitary mystic, and instead you find a spiritual landscape that is, honestly, highly bureaucratic. We are looking at a scenario where theology and colonial counterinsurgency are basically holding hands.
Yeah, holding hands and, filing reports in triplicate. It is arguably the absolute definition of a theological intelligence operation.
A theological intelligence operation? That's, wow.
And frankly, it is one of those fascinating, bizarre, and revealing intersections of empire building and religion you will ever come across in modern history.
So let's just lay out the mission for this deep dive for you, the listener. We are exploring a highly specific, highly critical chapter in the history of the Qadiyani or Ahmadiyya movement. We are looking at the 19th century colonial British occupation of India and how that specific geopolitical pressure cooker facilitated the calculated birth of a brand new religious ideology.
And we should be clear about our approach here.
Yes, to be absolutely crystal clear right out of the gate, we are not here to take theological sides.
Precisely. We are not theologians, and we aren't here to endorse or condemn the spiritual validity of anyone's personal beliefs.
No, not at all. That is not the goal. We are just looking at the historical paper trail.
We're acting as your guides to unpack the primary texts.
Exactly. The historical colonial records and the actual published writings of the movement's founder, a man named Mirza Ghulam Ahmed.
Right. We just want to understand what the documents actually reveal about the mechanics of this movement.
And the journey ahead of us is incredible. I mean, we are going to transition from a panicked, post-rebellion British strategy meeting in London to a monumental crowdfunding scheme.
A scheme that ended in one of the most audacious bait and switches in publishing history, I might add.
Oh, absolutely. All the way to a man who eventually claimed to be a prophet, the promised Messiah, and a Hindu deity, all at the exact same time.
It is a narrative that constantly defies expectations. Like every time you think you understand the structural goal of the movement, it pivots.
It really does. But to understand why it pivots and how anyone could possibly pull this off, we have to ground ourselves in the stark geopolitical reality of the mid-19th century.
You really cannot understand this movement without understanding the sheer terror the British Empire was experiencing at that exact moment.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because you can't build a new theology without a fertile environment, right?
Right.
And in this case, that environment was seeded by blood and panic. So set the stage for us. It's the mid-19th century.
So it's the mid-19th century. The British East India Company, and subsequently the British Crown, has effectively swallowed the Indian subcontinent.
Swallowed it whole.
Exactly. They are extracting wealth, imposing their laws, and managing hundreds of millions of people. But then, 1857 happens.
Right, 1857. The earthquake.
Yes, 1857 is the earthquake. There is a massive continent-spanning rebellion against British rule.
Often referred to as the Sepoy Mutiny, or the First War of Indian Independence.
Exactly. And we really need to understand the scale of this for you to grasp the context. This wasn't like a minor localized riot.
No, not at all.
It was a bloody, widespread, highly organized attempt to physically eject the British from India. I mean, entire garrisons mutinied.
All cities fell.
Cities fell. The British military apparatus was pushed to the absolute brink.
Yeah, and for a terrifying moment, the colonial leadership in London actually thought they were going to lose the crown jewel of their empire.
They were in full-blown panic mode.
And while the British ultimately did manage to crush the rebellion with brutal, overwhelming force, I might add the psychological damage to the empire was permanent.
It changed everything about how they governed.
Right. The dust settles, they execute the rebel leaders, they reestablish control, but they're left staring at a massive existential vulnerability.
Because they realized that sitting on top of a population of hundreds of millions of subjugated people with just a few thousand British troops.
It's a powder keg.
It's a complete powder keg. They survived 1857, but they know deep down they might not survive the next one.
Exactly. So the British intelligence apparatus goes into absolute overdrive.
They realize that raw military dominance isn't a sustainable long-term strategy. I mean, you can't just keep shooting people.
Right. Eventually you run out of bullets, or the population simply overwhelms you.
Exactly. So they begin studying the local populations with microscopic intensity. They need to understand what exactly fueled the core of the resistance.
And they zero in very quickly on a specific demographic, right? Yeah. The Muslim population of India.
They do. And I was reading the colonial assessments from this era. And the British didn't just target the Muslim population out of nowhere.
No, it was highly calculated. They recognized a specific, highly potent mechanism at play.
For the Muslims in India, resisting colonial rule wasn't just, a political grievance about taxes or land ownership.
Right. It wasn't just about economics.
It was a religious duty. The British realized they had run headfirst into the theological concept of jihad.
And we need to define how that was being applied in this specific context. Because in the eyes of many local Muslim scholars and lay people, India had been invaded.
Right. And invaded and occupied by a foreign, non-Muslim power that was actively disrupting their way of life.
Exactly. And that legally classified the subcontinent, in their theological framework, as a Dar al-Harb.
A land of war.
A land of war. And in a Dar al-Harb, fighting back against the occupier isn't just an option. It is a spiritual obligation.
Which is a colonial administrator's absolute worst nightmare.
Totally. Because, you can negotiate with a political rebel, you can bribe a local lord.
You can offer a tax break.
Right. But how do you negotiate with someone who believes the creator of the universe is commanding them to eject you?
You can't. You can shoot a soldier, but you cannot shoot an idea.
You cannot shoot an idea. And the British were incredibly pragmatic about this.
Very pragmatic. Between 1869 and 1870, the British government actually dispatched specific delegations.
Right, comprising British newspaper editors, political strategists.
And Christian leaders. They traveled throughout India to study how to pacify this specific theological threat.
They weren't looking for a military solution anymore?
No, they were looking for a psychological and theological countermeasure.
And the reports they generated are chillingly calculated. I was looking at the details of one specific report submitted back to London in 1870.
The one titled, The Arrival of the British Empire in India.
That's the one. The analysts essentially break down the sociology of the Indian Muslim population, and they arrive at a fascinating conclusion.
They state that the vast majority of the masses blindly follow their religious leaders.
Right. Therefore, the report concludes, if the British could find or cultivate a local figure willing to claim apostolic authority.
Someone claiming to be a prophet or a divinely guided leader.
Exactly. The empire could secretly sponsor and protect him.
It is literally a recipe for a state-sponsored prophet.
It's mind-blowing, but the logic is flawless from an imperial standpoint.
Absolutely flawless.
Yeah.
They needed a local, culturally authentic religious figure to actively preach loyalty to the British crown.
And not just as a political compromise?
No, as a direct commandment from God. They needed someone to stand up and tell the masses, God wants you to put down your swords. Opposing the British is opposing the divine will.
Which brings us to our protagonist, Mirza Ghulam Ahmed.
Now, if you were a British colonial intelligence officer looking to fill this incredibly specific, highly controversial job opening.
And frankly, dangerous job opening.
Very dangerous. Yeah. You do not just pick a random charismatic guy off the street. You need a vetted asset.
You look for a proven track record.
You look for deep generational loyalty. And the family of Mirza Ghulam Ahmed offered exactly that.
They were part of the local landed aristocracy in the Punjab region, right?
Yes, and they were historically, fiercely, and publicly loyal to the British Empire.
The historical records highlight that his father, Mirza Ghulam Murtaza, openly boasted about his service to the colonizers.
Remember that terrifying 1857 rebellion we just talked about?
Yeah, when the British were fighting for their lives.
Exactly. When the British were fighting for their lives, Mirza Ghulam Ahmed's father didn't sit on the sidelines.
And he certainly didn't join the rebellion.
No, he actively supplied 50 cavalrymen, fully equipped with horses, funded by his own family, to help the British hunt down and crush the local Indian resistance.
50 cavalrymen sent to slaughter their own countrymen on behalf of a foreign empire? That is, wow.
And the British, naturally, rewarded this. The family received official letters of thanks, certificates of recognition, and political favor from the colonial government.
And Mirza Ghulam Ahmed himself later wrote extensively about this legacy, didn't he?
He did. He wasn't hiding his family's collaboration. He wore it as a badge of honor.
Yeah, he wrote, quote, "We have not fallen short in shedding our blood and sacrificing our lives in the path of the British government."
Okay, let's unpack this. Because when you map this onto modern concepts, it sounds remarkably like a state-sponsored influencer campaign.
Oh, that's a great way to look at it.
Right. Imagine a government today realizing they have a PR crisis, so they hire a massive social media influencer.
But instead of an influencer selling you a lifestyle aesthetic or like a brand new energy drink,
this influencer is selling total theological submission to an occupying army.
Exactly. So how overt was this? I mean, was he operating in the shadows or was he openly coordinating this messaging?
It was startlingly overt. The paper trail is undeniable because he constantly reminded the British of his utility.
He wanted them to know what he was doing for them.
Exactly. Mirza Ghulam Ahmed's primary weapon on behalf of the empire was his pen.
He claimed to have written so many books, pamphlets, and leaflets explicitly forbidding the concept of jihad.
And demanding total, unquestioning obedience to the British government.
Right. And in his own words, he said they would fill 50 cupboards.
50 cupboards. That is an industrial, factory-level scale of propaganda.
You don't produce 50 cupboards of literature as a casual side hobby.
No, that is a full-time, dedicated psychological operation.
And he was crystal clear about his objective. In a preserved letter to the British Lieutenant Governor, he stated that for his entire adult life, he had been fighting with his tongue and his pen.
To turn the hearts of Muslims toward loyalty to the British government.
His stated goal was to scrub the very concept of armed resistance jihad from their minds.
He wanted to entirely eradicate the cultural anticipation of a bloody Mahdi, or a warrior messiah who would come to liberate them.
He actually wrote that his ultimate goal was to make sure the local populations viewed the British government as a divine blessing.
And this is where the genius of his theological engineering comes in.
Yeah, he reframes obedience entirely.
He doesn't say, hey, the British have bigger guns, so let's just pay our taxes and survive.
No, he elevates the British Empire to a theological pillar.
Yes, he effectively bifurcates the religion.
He wrote, quote, "My belief, which I state clearly, is that Islam has two parts. The first part is obedience to God, and the second part is obedience to the government that has established peace and given us shelter from oppressors, and that is the British government."
I want you, the listener, to really let that sink in.
Yeah, think about the implications of that.
You cannot be a good believer, you cannot achieve salvation without being a good, compliant subject of the British Crown.
That is the exact psychological countermeasure the 1870 British intelligence report ordered.
It is the precise blueprint executed to perfection. The British wanted to extract the concept of physical resistance from the religion, and Mirza Ghulam delivered a theology that amputated it entirely.
He argued that because the British allowed Muslims to practice their basic rituals, like daily prayer and fasting during Ramadan, the British were objectively a benevolent, God-ordained force.
Therefore, raising his sword against them wasn't just political treason.
It was an unforgivable sin against the Almighty.
Exactly. What's fascinating here is how this relationship evolved from mere propaganda into a deeply entrenched physical symbiosis.
Because Mirza Ghulam Ahmad wasn't just sitting alone in a room writing pamphlets forever.
No, he was actively gathering followers. As his specific sect, the Qadiyani movement, began to grow, they developed a geopolitical strategy.
A strategy that was entirely dependent on the survival and expansion of the British Empire.
They viewed the British Empire not as an exploitative colonizer bleeding the subcontinent dry, but as a literal divine shield.
And Mirza Ghulam Ahmad famously engaged in some intense theological gymnastics with the Quran itself to justify this, right?
He really did. He took a specific verse that mentions a rabwa,
which traditionally translates to like a high ground that provides security, water, and a resting place.
Exactly. He claimed that this ancient Quranic rabwa was actually a direct prophecy predicting the arrival of the British Empire in India.
Just to provide him and his followers with a safe haven.
To protect him. He explicitly said, if it wasn't for the sword of the British government, I would have faced what Jesus faced from the disbelievers.
Meaning, the local Muslim population would have absolutely crucified him for his controversial claims if the British military hadn't been standing there with rifles to protect him.
And honestly, he was probably right. His survival and the physical expansion of his entire sect was inextricably tied to British military protection.
The movement's success was geographically and politically yoked to the success of the empire.
Which explains one of the most jarring, almost surreal details in the historical record.
Oh, this part is wild. Because their survival depended on the British, the Qadiyani leadership actively publicly cheered when sovereign Islamic states fell to British military forces.
Yes. This is where theology dictates global politics. During World War I, British forces were engaged in massive campaigns across the Middle East,
conquering territories like Iraq and the Levant that had been under Islamic, specifically Ottoman, rule for centuries.
And while the broader Muslim world viewed this as a catastrophic geopolitical tragedy,
the Qadiyani leadership publicly rejoiced.
Basharuddin Mahmud, who was Mirza's son and the second supreme leader of the movement, gave a deeply revealing speech about this.
Yeah, when the British conquered Iraq, and later when they marched into Jerusalem, the broader Muslim community was in mourning.
But Basharuddin gave a public address basically saying, people criticize us for celebrating the British victories, but why shouldn't we celebrate?
He openly referred to the British government as their sword.
His logic was purely expansionist. He argued that British military expansion directly equated to Qadiyani theological expansion.
Right. Wherever the British flag was planted by force, Qadiyani missionaries could safely follow in the logistical wake of the army.
Protected by British law. So the violent military defeat of local Muslim populations in places like Baghdad and Jerusalem.
It was interpreted and celebrated as a divine victory for their specific sect.
Okay, I have to push back here, because this creates a massive cognitive dissonance.
It really does.
If a movement is ostensibly presenting itself to the public as Islamic, as a revival of the true faith, how on earth did they justify acting as an active intelligence apparatus against their own neighbors?
Because the records show they didn't just write pro-British essays, they actively spied for the colonial government.
They absolutely did, and they were incredibly effective at it.
The movement provided a steady stream of highly motivated spies, informants, and volunteers for the British intelligence network.
They acted as loyal agents, both inside India and later in foreign territories.
And crucially, they weren't ashamed of this.
Not at all. The official Qadiyani newspaper, Al-Fasl, openly boasted in print that they provided the British government with the absolute best spies.
People who were religiously motivated to shed their blood for the British cause.
There is a specific logistical tactic they used that just blew my mind. The Qadianis actually created a secret registry to hunt down dissidents.
Yes, the infamous Dar al-Harb registry. Let's look at the mechanics of this because it's devious.
The British authorities were terrified of Muslims, who secretly held the belief that India was a Dar al-Harb,
a land of war where jihad was a requirement.
But identifying these individuals was a logistical nightmare for a British magistrate.
I mean, a local farmer or shopkeeper isn't going to confess his anti-colonial sentiments to a British officer in a tailored uniform.
Exactly. But they might express those frustrations to a local religious group or during a theological debate in the village square.
Precisely. And the Qadiyani leadership recognized this informational asymmetry and completely exploited it.
They initiated a systematic strategy to identify these anti-British individuals under the guise of religious discussion.
When they identified someone who believed in armed resistance, they recorded their name,
their exact address, their profession,
and their physical identifying marks.
And then Mirza Ghulam Ahmed compiled these names into a master registry and handed this secret hit list directly over to the British colonial authorities.
As a gesture of his profound political goodwill.
Just think about the sheer betrayal of that. He compiled a targeted database of political dissidents and handed it to the occupying military empire.
And how did he justify sending his own countrymen to the gallows or to colonial prisons?
By returning flawlessly to his core theological premise.
Right. If you accept the premise that opposing the British is opposing God's chosen protectors,
then these dissidents aren't freedom fighters. They are dangerous evildoers violating the divine order.
He framed political espionage as a religious duty. He wrote openly that he kept these registries as a secret policy to aid the benevolent government in maintaining peace.
It's a breathtaking inversion. The traditional historical narrative is almost always about religion fueling resistance to an empire.
Yeah. Here, the religion is entirely weaponized by the empire for the empire against the local population.
But this begs a massive logistical question.
Which is?
If this guy is widely known to be a fiercely loyal British asset, compiling hit lists for the colonizers, how does he gain a local following in the first place?
That's a great question. Why would a single Indian Muslim in the 1880s listen to a word he says?
Because he didn't start out advertising his espionage.
Ah, right.
That is the strategic genius of his early career. He knew that if he walked out into the public square in 1880 and shouted, "I am a prophet of God, and we must all serve the British,"
he would have been laughed out of the province.
Or instantly assassinated. He had to build a credible, localized platform first. He needed immense social capital.
Here's where it gets really interesting. He builds this social capital by stepping into the ring as a heavyweight debater.
In late 19th century India, the theological landscape was an absolute war zone.
You had well-funded Christian missionaries aggressively trying to convert the population with British backing.
You had muscular Hindu reformist movements, particularly the Arya Samaj, pushing back fiercely against both Islam and Christianity to reclaim the cultural narrative.
It was a chaotic marketplace of intense public religious debate.
And Mirza Ghulam Ahmed steps into this chaotic arena not as a British lackey, but as a fierce, articulate defender of Islam.
He challenges the top Christian missionaries to public debates. He writes scathing rebuttals against the Hindu scholars.
And he is genuinely skilled at it. He is well-read, sharp, and aggressive.
To the average Indian Muslim who feels culturally besieged by the colonial administration, economically marginalized,
and theologically attacked by rival religions,
Mirza looks like a hero. He looks like the champion they've been waiting for.
He becomes a populist icon. This wins him immense respect.
And more importantly, it wins him access to massive financial support.
Because people want to back a winner. They want to fund the guy who is successfully defending their honor in the public square.
Which sets the stage for what I can only describe as one of the greatest crowdfunding masterclasses of the 19th century.
Oh, the Barahin Ahmadiyya project.
Exactly. Mirza recognizes his leverage and announces a monumental project. He tells the public he is going to write the definitive, ultimate book defending the faith.
Called Barahin Ahmadiyya.
And the pitch is irresistible. He promises this magnum opus will contain exactly 300 undeniable, ironclad proofs of the truth of Islam.
He frames it as the ultimate weapon that will silence the Christian missionaries and the Arya Samaj forever.
But, he caveats, a scholarly work of this immense magnitude is going to require 50 massive volumes.
And to pull it off, he needs the community to fund the entire project up front.
It was an unprecedented financial ask for a private author at that time.
But the public, riding the emotional high of his debate victories, enthusiastically opened their wallets.
Prominent Orthodox scholars, wealthy merchants, and everyday working people poured immense sums of money into this project.
They were pre-ordering the intellectual salvation of their community.
I look at this and I immediately think of a disastrous early Kickstarter campaign.
Yes. We all know the playbook.
Right. The creator posts an incredible, slick pitch video. They promise a revolutionary product, a video game that will change the world, or a magical cooler with a built-in blender.
They take millions of dollars in pre-orders.
And then the timeline stretches. The updates start getting really weird.
And when the product finally ships, it is completely unrecognizable from what was promised.
That is a remarkably accurate analogy, because what Mirza Ghulam Ahmed actually delivered to his backers was the ultimate bait and switch.
Let's break down the actual timeline of this delivery. The donors are sitting there, having paid for 50 volumes of theological proofs.
Finally, Volume 1 drops in 1880. What is actually inside the book?
When the backers open Volume 1, they don't find the promised 300 proofs.
Surprise, surprise.
Instead, the volume is overwhelmingly dedicated to praising Mirza Ghulam Ahmed himself.
It details his personal piety, his claimed miracles, his grand visions, and his supposed divine inspirations.
Okay, so the donors are a bit confused, maybe a little annoyed, but they give him the benefit of the doubt. It's an introduction, right? Setting the stage.
Then Volume 2 comes out.
Volume 2 is basically a continuation of Volume 1. Heavy on the self-aggrandizement, heavy on establishing his special, elevated status with God.
And critically, still absolutely devoid of the 300 definitive proofs against Christianity and Hinduism.
Then we hit Volumes 3 and 4, which are published around 1882 and 1884.
And this is where the Kickstarter goes so far off the rails, it crashes into a different dimension.
Yes, in Volumes 3 and 4, the thematic focus abruptly shifts.
The text becomes heavily populated with effusive praise for the British government.
He uses these volumes, funded by the local Muslim population, to argue vehemently against the concept of jihad.
And to convince his readers that submitting to the British Empire is a religious imperative.
He essentially took the crowdfunding capital raised from an anti-colonial population and used it to publish pro-British propaganda.
The Orthodox scholars and community leaders who funded him suddenly realize they've been had.
They realize he isn't building a fortress to defend the faith. He's building a cult of personality.
And acting as an unpaid PR agent for the occupying colonizers.
The backlash is fierce. They demand the rest of the books. They say, "We paid for 50 volumes of 300 proofs. Where are the remaining 46 volumes?"
And this is where Mirza's sheer audacity, his sheer refusal to yield to conventional logic, truly shines.
He doesn't apologize. He doesn't promise to work harder.
He simply stops.
He publishes Volume 5 and unilaterally declares the entire 50-volume project complete.
And the excuse he gives to his furious donors, which is meticulously documented in his own writings, is just mind-boggling.
When they demand to know how 5 volumes equates to 50, his official published justification was that there is fundamentally no real difference between the number 50 and the number 5.
Except for a single tiny zero.
A dot. Therefore, by delivering 5 volumes, he had effectively spiritually fulfilled his promise of 50.
It is a staggering piece of rhetorical evasion.
He essentially argued that the mathematical difference was just a dot on a page, and therefore the essence of the promise remained intact.
And crucially, he absolutely refused to refund a single rupee.
The massive influx of capital he secured from the Barahin Ahmadiyya project achieved its true purpose. It solidified his absolute financial independence.
He didn't need to be a low-level clerk in the local colonial court anymore. He was now a fully funded, entirely independent religious institution.
He took the money, radically changed the product, gaslit his investors with a mathematical absurdity, and walked away rich.
But he didn't walk away into obscurity. He used that financial war chest and the small core of fanatically loyal followers who actually bought his zero excuse
to launch something much, much bigger.
Which brings us to a phase of his life that operates like a masterclass in psychological manipulation. The escalator of divine claims.
Mission creep on a cosmic scale.
Once he had the financial base secured and he had weeded out the skeptics, he began to slowly, methodically escalate his own religious status.
The historical timeline shows he was incredibly calculated about this. He didn't just walk out onto his balcony one morning in 1880 and shout, "I am a new prophet of God."
Right. If he had done that, the British protection wouldn't have mattered. The local population would have entirely ignored him or rioted.
Because the theological boundaries of Islam regarding prophethood are notoriously rigid.
Exactly. We have to understand the doctrine of Khan Anubuwa, the seal of the prophets.
In mainstream Islamic theology, this is a non-negotiable bedrock principle. It asserts that Muhammad is the final prophet sent to humanity, and the mechanism of divine legislative prophethood is permanently closed.
Claiming to be a new prophet is an instant, unpardonable disqualifier. It is the theological equivalent of declaring yourself a new god.
So Mirza knew he couldn't jump straight to the top floor. He had to boil the frogs slowly.
Let's trace this timeline of titles for you, because watching him move the goalposts year by year is fascinating. He starts the escalation in 1880. What is his first major claim?
In 1880s, right around the time he publishes that first volume of his book, he claims to be a mujaddid.
Now, in Islamic tradition, a mujaddid is a renewer of the faith.
There's a theological concept that at the turn of every Islamic century, God sends a deeply inspired scholar to clear away cultural innovations and restore the original purity of the religion.
It's a position of immense high status and respect, but critically, it is not prophethood. It is perfectly acceptable within the bounds of Orthodox theology.
Right, so the public can swallow that. They think, okay, he's a brilliant scholar, a renewer of the age. That makes sense.
He lets that simmer for a few years. Then, in 1888, he takes the next step up the escalator.
In 1888, he announces that he's been divinely commanded to demand a formal pledge of allegiance, a bay'ah, from his followers.
This shifts the dynamic entirely. You are no longer just a student agreeing with a scholar.
You are a disciple swearing formal, absolute spiritual loyalty to a master.
This is the moment he begins walling off a distinct, separated community from the broader population.
The psychological walls are going up around the in-group.
Then 1891 arrives, and he makes a massive, highly controversial jump.
In 1891, he declares himself to be the promised Messiah and the Mahdi.
Okay, let's break this down. In Islamic eschatology, the Messiah is Jesus returning at the end of days, and the Mahdi is a divinely guided leader who will unite the believers.
Mirza steps up and claims he is both of these figures combined into one person.
How does he mathematically justify being Jesus?
By entirely rewriting the accepted history of Jesus.
Mainstream Islam believes Jesus was raised alive to heaven and will physically return.
Mirza argued that this was irrational. He claimed that Jesus survived the crucifixion, fled the Middle East, traveled all the way to Kashmir in India, lived to an old age, and died there.
Therefore, the prophecy of the Messiah returning couldn't be literal. It had to be metaphorical.
And Mirza claimed he was the spiritual second coming. He had the spirit and power of Jesus.
This, predictably, creates a massive uproar. But even then, he hesitates on using the final, forbidden word, prophet.
Throughout the 1890s, when Orthodox scholars accuse him of crossing the line into claiming prophethood, he uses incredibly evasive, slippery language.
He calls himself a partial prophet, or a shadow prophet.
Or he says, I am only a prophet in the linguistic sense of receiving news, not in the theological sense of bringing a new law.
He plays exhausting semantic games to keep from being totally excommunicated.
But the escalator keeps moving up. The momentum demands it.
By 1901, his community is deeply entrenched. He has robust, unquestioning British protection.
He realizes he no longer needs to appease the Orthodox scholars because he has his own ecosystem.
So he discards the semantic games, he officially upgrades his status and declares himself a full, undeniable prophet.
He retroactively states that all his previous writings where he denied being a full prophet were based on a misunderstanding of his own revelations.
And those denials are now abrogated.
Wait, hold on. Let me get this straight.
Yeah.
He claims God was speaking to him for 20 years, but he just misunderstood what God was saying about his own job title.
And then he finally figured it out in 1901.
That was the official justification, yes.
It is wild. But then in 1904, we get the plot twist that absolutely shatters whatever theological logic was left.
He doesn't just stop at being a monotheistic Muslim prophet.
In 1904, he issues a proclamation claiming to be an avatar of the Hindu deity Krishna.
It is a staggering, almost incomprehensible claim.
He addresses the massive Hindu population of India and says, essentially, Just as I am the promised Messiah for the Muslims and Christians, I am the reincarnation of King Krishna for you.
I have to throw a flag on the play here. How on earth did he expect to manage these massive contradictions?
You fundamentally, logically, cannot be a strict monotheistic Muslim prophet who preaches absolute adherence to one invisible God,
And simultaneously claim to be the avatar of a Hindu deity from a polytheistic pantheon.
Those two theological systems are entirely structurally incompatible. How did anyone buy this?
If we connect this to the bigger picture of how he operated, we see a strategy of deliberate ambiguity and hypersegmentation.
Mirza essentially pioneered a corporate demographic strategy for religion.
He tailored his message to completely different audiences, assuming they wouldn't compare notes.
When speaking to his core Muslim followers, he used dense Islamic terminology.
When addressing the British administrators, he was the humble, loyal servant of the crown.
When addressing the Hindus, he adopted their rich theological language.
He was trying to monopolize the spiritual market share of the entire subcontinent.
Precisely. The documentary evidence suggests this wasn't just a natural theological evolution.
It was a calculated expansion of his target demographic. He wanted to appeal to every single religious demographic in India.
He developed a theological concept, claiming that God had combined the essence of all past prophets and divine figures into his single person.
But the internal contradictions were tearing his own narrative apart.
The records show he couldn't even keep his own genealogy straight.
When he needed to sound aristocratic to local elites, he claimed Mughal descent.
Then, when he received a specific revelation, he suddenly announced his family was actually Persian.
Later, to appeal to a broader, perhaps more exotic demographic, he claimed he was Chinese in origin.
And finally, to establish supreme religious authority, he claimed direct bloodline descent from Fatima, the Prophet Muhammad's daughter,
while simultaneously claiming descent from the biblical Isaac.
He was building a composite identity, and when confronted with these blatant contradictions by critics, the sources quote his standard defense.
He simply stated, "God informed me."
Every contradiction, every shifted goalpost, every geographical impossibility was papered over with a claim of direct, unquestionable divine revelation.
Which brings us to perhaps the most revealing and, frankly, bizarre aspect of this entire deep dive.
The actual published text of his claimed revelation.
Yes. Let's talk about the Wahi, the divine revelations.
Because when you think of the concept of the creator of the universe speaking to a human being, you expect profound spiritual guidance.
You expect poetic majesty, moral clarity, something that shakes the soul.
But when you dive into the primary texts of Mirza's claimed revelations, which his followers meticulously compiled into a massive book called Tadkira, you don't get majestic poetry.
You get a confusing, chaotic, sometimes comical linguistic mashup.
It is an absolute linguistic disaster. The compilers highlight that his revelations didn't arrive in one coherent language.
They came in fragments of Arabic, Persian, Urdu, and, bizarrely, English.
And not just any English. We are talking about highly broken English.
Imagine this scenario. A man living in a rural Indian village in the 19th century claims the Almighty, the architect of the cosmos, is speaking directly into his mind.
And the profound message from the divine is, quote, "I love you, I am with you, I shall help you."
And my absolute personal favorite, a grammatical masterpiece.
I
care for what I will do.
It reads like someone flipping through a rudimentary English phrasebook.
And the visual nature of these visions is even more telling.
He recorded a vision where he claimed the angel delivering the revelation appeared to him.
But it wasn't a terrifying biblical seraphim or an entity of pure light.
He claimed the angel appeared in the form of a 20-year-old English youth sitting politely on a chair by a desk.
It is incredible. The divine realm, in the mind of this supposed prophet, is literally staffed by British colonial clerks.
You couldn't possibly ask for a more glaring psychological tell.
This man was so utterly subsumed by the overwhelming power and bureaucracy of the British Empire that his very subconscious, his supposed conduit to the divine, took the form of an English administrator doing paperwork.
It reveals exactly where his ultimate awe and his ultimate fear were truly directed. He couldn't conceptualize power without conceptualizing the British.
And it wasn't just the English revelations that were highly problematic. His attempts to produce Arabic revelations to legitimize his Islamic credentials were an equal disaster.
Ah, yes, the Quranic remix.
This is where he attempts to prove his prophethood by producing a text that he claims matches the linguistic miracle of the Quran.
He produces 97 pages of Arabic, and challenges the entire world to write anything that can compete with its divine style.
He banked on the fact that most of his followers in rural Punjab didn't actually speak or read classical Arabic.
But Orthodox scholars who did examine the text were astounded, not by its beauty, but by its sheer laziness.
It wasn't original Arabic poetry or prose. It was a literal patchwork.
He took existing, famous verses of the Quran, chopped them into fragments, and glued them back together with his own basic transition words.
I look at this exactly like a terrible DJ creating a mashup track.
You know when a DJ takes the soaring vocal track from a sacred, beautiful hymn and forcibly overlays it onto a cheap, repetitive pop beat and then stands behind the turntable pretending they just composed a masterpiece?
That's what he did. He took fragments of profoundly sacred text and scrambled them.
And in doing so, he destroyed the grammar and completely inverted the original meanings.
The compiled texts show pages where one sentence is in Urdu, the next clause is in butchered Arabic, and the conclusion is in Persian.
It doesn't read like the word of the Almighty. It reads like the output of a broken AI algorithm trying to hallucinate a religious text.
And this sheer lack of divine authority brings us to a crucial historical anecdote that perfectly, tragically illustrates the tension between his massive claims of cosmic power and his absolute subservience to earthly colonial power.
We have to discuss the incident with his vocal rival, Saadullah.
This is deeply revealing.
No.
It is the ultimate showdown of fear of the crown versus the word of God. Walk us through what happened here.
Mirza Ghulam Ahmed utilized a very specific terror tactic against his critics.
If an Orthodox scholar debated him and won, or if someone criticized him too loudly in the press, Mirza would frequently claim to receive a divine revelation that the specific critic would die within a certain time frame, usually 15 months or 2 years.
It was a way to silence opposition through supernatural intimidation.
In this specific case, he was feuding with a man named Saadullah, and Mirza claimed he received a direct divine revelation predicting Saadullah's imminent miserable death.
Right, so he claims he possesses the word of God, he holds the ultimate cosmic spoiler, he knows the future.
Exactly. He prepares to publish this revelation in his newspaper, to show the world his terrifying prophetic power.
But right before he sends it to the printing press, a close follower, who happened to act as his legal advisor regarding British law, warns him.
The follower says, essentially, Mirza, if you publish a targeted death threat against a specific citizen, the British magistrate doesn't care if you call it a divine revelation.
The Colonial Penal Code classifies this as criminal intimidation. If you print this, the government will arrest you.
And what does the prophet of God, the promised Messiah, the avatar of Krishna, do?
He immediately backs down. He spikes the publication.
And the most incredible part is that he admits it in his own writings.
He actually wrote an explanation stating that he suppressed the divine revelation because his advisor warned him of the legal consequences from the colonial government.
He literally penned the words that he held back the decree of God because, quote, the government does not leave criminals alone.
The irony is just staggering. It is thick enough to cut with a knife.
Here is a man who claims to speak for the creator of the universe, who claims to hold the keys to heaven and hell, and he quietly puts the revelation back in his desk drawer because he is terrified of getting a fine from a local British magistrate.
The earthly bureaucratic law of the colonial empire officially vetoed the supposed decree of heaven.
It proves from his own pen that his ultimate sovereign was the British crown, not God. When the will of the two conflicted, the British crown won effortlessly and instantly.
And when his prophecies did fail publicly, which they frequently did, like his highly publicized failed predictions regarding marrying a specific woman, or his promises that certain followers would birth sons only for them to birth daughters, he would resort to wild, desperate justifications.
Which leads to one of my favorite absurdities in the entire historical record, the ring miracle.
Ah, yes. The attempt to prove prophethood via personal jewelry.
I found this detail in the texts and had to read it 3 times to ensure I wasn't misunderstanding it.
Mirza claimed, as ironclad proof of his divine mission, that he possessed a specific gemstone ring.
And engraved on this ring was the Arabic phrase, "Is not God sufficient for his servant?"
Now, that's a lovely, pious sentiment. Millions of people have similar phrases on jewelry.
But Mirza claimed this was a profound miracle because he had purchased and engraved this ring 30 years before he announced he was a prophet.
He presented this mundane timeline to his followers as undeniable supernatural proof.
He argued that the mere fact he bought a ring with a pious phrase on it 3 decades ago was God secretly setting the stage for his eventual prophethood.
I want you, the listener, to really ponder the logic being employed here. Think about how buying a piece of jewelry constitutes a divine miracle.
If I buy a novelty t-shirt at a mall that says future CEO when I'm 16 years old, and then 30 years later I actually start a mid-sized paper company, that isn't a miraculous tear in the fabric of space and time.
That is just the delayed coincidence of a highly generic slogan.
But to his followers, this was presented and accepted as profound, earth-shattering evidence of his divine mandate.
It really highlights the psychological state and the demographic reality of his followers. Mirza relied heavily on the localized ignorance of his specific audience.
He often targeted rural populations that were poorly educated, people who couldn't read the classical Arabic he was butchering, or who lacked the theological education to spot the glaring contradictions in his claims.
In fact, his own writings display a staggering contempt for his own followers.
He described the people of his hometown of Qadiyani before his arrival as being like beasts who didn't know the basics of Islam or the Quran.
He relied entirely on a localized vacuum of knowledge to elevate himself as the sole source of truth.
Furthermore, we have to look at the bizarre physical and psychological state of Mirza himself, as documented by his closest devotees.
While claiming to be the perfect, ultimate manifestation of all historical prophets, the zenith of human spiritual evolution, the texts written by his own son and his top lieutenants describe him suffering from a staggering, almost unbelievable list of ailments.
The medical list is intense. His followers documented that he suffered from severe melancholia, hysteria, chronic and debilitating diabetes.
A specific condition where he claimed he had to urinate up to 100 times a single night.
Severe vertigo that left him unable to stand.
And a right arm that was so weak and injured he literally couldn't lift a cup of water to his own mouth.
And you might ask, why would a cult of personality document the extreme physical frailties of their divine leader?
The sources reveal they documented these illnesses to claim another miracle.
The convoluted logic was this. How could a man this physically destroyed, this mentally exhausted?
A man who, according to his own son's writings, routinely couldn't even tell his right shoe from his left shoe.
Possibly write so many books and pamphlets unless God was directly possessing his pen.
It is the ultimate PR spin. I am so physically incompetent and mentally incapable of basic tasks that my worldly success must therefore be supernatural.
But as the historical and colonial records point out with brutal clarity, his success wasn't supernatural. It was highly structural.
It was underwritten, protected, and facilitated by the largest, most powerful military empire on the face of the earth.
Exactly. The severe illnesses, the linguistic failures, the incredibly foul language he used against his opponents.
Routinely calling Orthodox scholars pigs, dogs, and children of prostitutes in his published works.
All of this behavior directly contradicted the noble prophetic character he claimed to embody.
But ultimately, the contradictions didn't matter, because his geopolitical utility to the British Empire remained intact.
As long as he preached submission, the British ensured he survived.
So, what does this all mean for us today? We have journeyed through an incredibly chaotic, deeply revealing historical landscape.
We've traced the arc of a movement that didn't begin with a revelation on a mountaintop, but as a calculated, pragmatic solution in a panicked British colonial strategy meeting in 1870.
We watched that strategy manifest in a man who leveraged generational loyalty to an occupier, used a crowdfunding scheme to build a war chest, and then morphed from a self-proclaimed defender of the faith into a prophet, a messiah, and a deity.
And he executed all of this while simultaneously operating a deeply effective, highly destructive intelligence network for an occupying empire, handing over dissidents to the magistrates.
He built a theology that equated absolute political surrender with eternal spiritual salvation.
He claimed his divine miracles numbered in the millions, yet his revelations were suppressed out of fear of a local magistrate's fine.
He preached a gospel of total peace and non-resistance, yet his leadership openly cheered the violent military conquest of their co-religionists in Iraq and Jerusalem because it expanded their own footprint.
If we look at the ultimate conclusions drawn by the history we've unpacked today, the true, lasting success of the Qadiyani movement wasn't found in its theological consistency.
As we've extensively explored, the theology was highly flawed, linguistically chaotic, and riddled with irreconcilable contradictions.
It was a theological house of cards built on a foundation of shifting genealogies and broken English angels.
Yes. But the House of Cards stood firm and continues to stand because of its symbiotic alignment with the geopolitical power of its time.
The British Empire desperately needed a pacifier to neutralize the threat of jihad, and Mirza Ghulam Ahmed desperately needed a military protector to survive his own blasphemy.
They provided each other with exactly what they required to survive and expand in 19th century India. The theology was always secondary to the utility.
It is a staggering historical reality check.
It forces us to look past the grand, sweeping claims of spiritual leaders and look at the actual paperwork. Look at the bank accounts, the colonial allegiances, and the quiet, bureaucratic alliances that actually shape the course of history.
Which leaves us with a final, lingering thought for you to mull over as we wrap up.
When we look back at the 19th century, it's relatively easy to spot the alliances between religious movements and the political empires of the past.
The letters are declassified in the archives. The history is written. The dust is settled. We can see the strings.
But it forces you to wonder. In our modern world, where information moves at lightning speed, where online echo chambers form overnight, and where new ideologies sweep across social media in a matter of hours, how many of the ideological, cultural, or even spiritual movements we see rising today are actually just calculated extensions of modern geopolitical power?
When you see a massive new influencer, a sudden thought leader, or a viral movement demanding your total ideological submission, demanding you cut ties with your community, who is really pulling the strings behind the movements we are told to believe in?
Are you following a prophet, or are you just engaging with an intelligence operation? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep reading the primary documents, keep looking behind the curtain, and above all, keep questioning the narratives you encounter. We'll see you next time.
Imagine a single man operating out of a rural village in 19th century India, looking up at a solar eclipse and basically telling the world, I caused that.
Right, he's saying, that celestial event happened specifically for me.
Yeah. And then, just to make sure he really has everyone's attention, he adds, by the way, I am the second coming of Jesus Christ. I'm the return of the prophet Muhammad. And for good measure, I'm the avatar of the Hindu deity Krishna.
All at the exact same time. I mean, it is the ultimate theological monopoly.
It really is. He's claiming the highest spiritual office in three entirely different, totally incompatible world religions simultaneously.
Which is just staggering when you think about it.
Welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah.
If you've ever wondered how entirely new belief systems are born, or how a charismatic figure, engineers their own legitimacy from the ground up, today is going to completely blow your mind.
Absolutely. Our mission for this deep dive is to examine a very specific, fiercely debated slice of source material. We are unpacking a highly critical Orthodox Islamic theological and historical text that completely breaks down the rise of Mirza Ghulam Ahmed and the Ahmadiyya or Qadiyani movement.
And we are really zeroing in on the pivotal middle era of his life, basically the mechanics of his escalation.
Exactly. Because this source text attempts to answer what is fundamentally a baffling question. How does a man go from being an unemployed clerk and a local religious debater to claiming to be the prophesied savior of the entire world?
Right. It's a massive leap. But before we get into the wild historical details, we really need to lay down the ground rules for how we are handling this material today.
That is crucial. The source text we're analyzing today is not a neutral historical biography.
No, not at all.
It is fiercely critical. It's written from a strict Orthodox Sunni Islamic perspective, and its stated purpose is to systematically dismantle the theological and historical claims of Ghulam Ahmed.
So as your guides on this deep dive, we're not here to take a theological side.
Right.
Nor are we endorsing the religious verdicts of the author. We are simply acting as impartial reporters of this text.
We're going to unpack exactly what the author argues. We'll examine the historical incidents they highlight, the bizarre contradictions they point out, and the textual evidence they use to build their case.
We are dissecting the anatomy of a critique. So you have to put yourself in the shoes of someone living in the era we are about to discuss.
Yeah, context is everything here.
To understand how anyone could possibly buy into these massive claims, you really have to understand the boiling cauldron that was late 19th century colonial India. Can you paint that picture for us?
You really have to step back to the year 1857. That is the great fracture point. The Indian Rebellion, what the British called the Sepoy Mutiny.
Or the First War of Independence, right?
Exactly. The British Empire brutally crushed this massive uprising, and the psychological, political, and economic fallout, specifically on the Muslim population, was just devastating.
Because the British blamed them.
Mostly, yes. The British viewed the Muslims as the primary instigators of the rebellion, driven by the theological concept of jihad.
So the British aren't just taking political control. They are actively targeting the ideological frameworks that fueled the resistance.
Precisely. The old Mughal structures are gone. Persian is replaced by English as the language of administration. Islamic scholars are executed or sidelined.
Wow.
So by the 1870s and 1880s, you have a Muslim population that feels deeply fractured, politically impotent, and searching for an identity.
And into this massive void step two major ideological challengers, right?
Yeah. First, you have Christian missionaries who are heavily backed by the colonial government. They are aggressively preaching and holding public debates.
Trying to prove that Islam is a defeated religion.
Right, because the political defeat is being framed as a spiritual defeat.
Yeah.
Our empire won, therefore our God is the true God.
That's a brutal narrative to fight against.
And simultaneously, you have massive Hindu revivalist movements, most notably the Arya Samaj, led by figures like Dayananda Saraswati.
Right.
They are pushing back fiercely against the Christian missionaries, but they are also violently attacking Islamic theology.
So the public square in colonial India is just this chaotic, highly publicized arena of religious debate. Everyone is publishing pamphlets, holding multi-day public arguments, trying to assert dominance.
The anxiety must have been suffocating.
Seriously. If you are a traditional Muslim in this era, you are watching your political power vanish, your language disappear from the courts, and your faith being publicly attacked from two different sides every single day.
You are desperate for a win. You are desperate for a champion.
Which brings us to Mirza Ghulam Ahmed, because he recognizes this exact desperation.
He really does. The Orthodox source material points out that Ahmad doesn't start his public life by claiming to be a prophet.
That would have gotten him laughed out of the room.
Exactly. He starts out by offering exactly what the community is starving for defense. He positions himself as a fierce intellectual champion of Islam.
He's writing articles, he's engaging in these public debates with the Arya Samajists and the Christian missionaries.
He basically becomes the articulate bulldog the community feels it desperately needs.
And he builds immense credibility doing this. The source actually notes that traditional scholars initially supported him because he was effective.
He was fighting the battles they felt they were losing.
But this credibility, it becomes the currency for what the source text essentially frames as the greatest Kickstarter scam of the 19th century.
Oh, the Barahin Ahmadiyya controversy.
Yes. Let's get into this. Ahmad has everyone's attention. He has the goodwill of the community. And he decides to capitalize on it with a massive announcement.
He tells the public that he is going to write the ultimate definitive defense of the Islamic faith.
An intellectual fortress so impenetrable that it will silence all Hindu and Christian critics forever.
He calls it Barahin Ahmadiyya, which translates to the Ahmadiyya proofs. And the scale of this promise is just staggering.
Right. He promises 300 definitive, undeniable proofs of the truth of Islam.
And he says this masterwork is going to require 50 volumes to fully explain.
Now, in 1880s, India, producing a 50-volume set of highly theological bound books, is not just a weekend writing project.
No, it requires massive capital. He needs printing presses, paper, distribution networks.
So what does he do? He crowdfunds it. He sends out appeals to wealthy benefactors, to religious scholars, to everyday lay people who are just desperate to see their faith defended.
He asks for advance funds. And according to the Orthodox critics writing at the time, the response was overwhelming.
People practically emptied their pockets.
They really believed in the mission. They wanted to be part of this great intellectual counteroffensive. So he collected significant funds based purely on the promise of these 50 volumes.
But here is where the source text points out the massive bait and switch. He starts publishing. Volume 1 comes out in 1880, then Volume 2.
Right, and by 1884, he manages to release Volume 4.
And then the presses just stop. The great 50-volume project that everyone prepaid for comes to a grinding halt.
After a few years, he eventually releases a 5th volume, but that is it. 5 volumes instead of 50.
You can imagine the reaction of the investors.
Oh, the traditional scholars, the people who sent their life savings, they start sending letters. They are demanding answers.
They're asking the obvious question, where are the other 45 books? We paid for 300 proofs across 50 volumes.
And the justification he gives, which the author of our source text highlights to demonstrate what they view as his sheer audacity, is almost comedic.
It really is.
Yeah.
According to Ahmed's own written response, he basically said, yes, I originally intended to write 50 volumes, but I have written 5.
Right.
And since the only difference between the number 50 and the number 5 is a single 0, I have effectively fulfilled my promise.
It is an incredible piece of linguistic manipulation.
It's mathematical gaslighting. I mean, think about this. If you go online today and crowdfund a 50-piece smart home security system, and a year later a box arrives with 5 light bulbs in it.
The CEO can't email you and say, hey, the difference between 50 and 5 is just a 0, so consider the contract fulfilled.
Exactly. That is absurd. The source text brings this up to show that this wasn't just a guy who got writer's block. This was a calculated maneuver.
The Orthodox scholars writing the critique view this as the defining moment the mask slipped. But the controversy wasn't just about the missing 45 books.
Right. The real outrage was what he actually printed inside the 5 volumes he did deliver.
Because the content entirely shifted away from the promised mission. The source details how the first couple of volumes had some basic defenses of the faith, but they were overwhelmingly padded with self-praise.
Instead of dismantling the arguments of the Christian missionaries, he started filling the pages with lists of his own supposed miracles.
His personal spiritual visions and arguments for his own greatness. He made himself the main character of the defense.
And it goes further, doesn't it?
It does. By volumes 3, 4, and the eventual volume 5, the text argues he pivoted his political stance completely.
Right. Back to the British.
Remember, the Muslim population was heavily suppressed by the British because the British feared jihad-armed resistance. Ahmed uses these crowd-funded volumes to extensively praise the British colonial government.
He calls them a blessing.
And crucially, he issues a theological decree that armed jihad against the British is now religiously forbidden.
Let me make sure I'm connecting the dots here because this is a massive shift. He uses the community's desire to defend their faith to get funding.
Yes.
But once he has the money and the audience, he uses that exact platform to build a cult of personality around himself while simultaneously pacifying the population to appease the colonial authorities.
That is the exact causal chain the Orthodox source constructs. They view the Barahin Ahmadiyya not as a failed literary project, but as the foundational scam of his movement.
It was the vehicle that transitioned him from being a servant of the faith to demanding the faith serve him.
And the British, of course, were thrilled. Here is a popular local religious figure telling the restless population that resisting the empire was a sin against God.
So he's dodged his investors with a mathematical technicality, and he's completely changed the subject of his own books.
But if the math of his publishing was confusing, the actual revelations he claimed to start receiving while writing these books were even more chaotic.
This takes us to the second phase of his escalation outlined in the text, the linguistic salad and the fearful prophet.
To understand the Orthodox outrage here, we have to briefly define the mechanics of divine communication in Islamic theology. It is very strict.
Okay, so lay it out for us.
The highest form of revelation is called wahys. This is the direct, infallible word of God brought by an angel. And Orthodox Islam holds that wahys is permanently sealed.
It ended with the Prophet Muhammad.
Exactly. No new scripture, no new prophets. The door is locked and bolted.
So what is Ahmed claiming?
Well, below wahy, there are concepts like ilham, which means inspiration, and kash, which means spiritual unveiling. These are accepted in the mystical traditions of Islam.
Like a true dream or an intuition?
Yes. Saints or pious people might receive an ilham, but it is never considered binding scripture, and it absolutely does not make you a prophet.
So Ahmed starts operating in this gray area.
Exactly. Ahmed starts claiming he is receiving constant ilham and kash. But he begins elevating the status of these inspirations, treating them as if they are infallible, binding directives from God.
He's inching right up to the line of claiming prophethood.
Trying to gain the authority of a prophet without triggering the massive Orthodox backlash of using the actual word.
But the author of our source text doesn't just attack the theology of these claims. They mercilessly mock the content.
They really do.
Because these supposed divine messages weren't coming down in pristine classical Arabic. The text highlights that Ahmed claimed God was speaking to him in a disjointed, ungrammatical blender of Arabic Quranic verses, Persian idioms, Urdu phrasing, and bizarrely English.
The English revelations are a massive focal point for the critics. You have to remember, Ahmed didn't speak fluent English. He was surrounded by the British colonial administration, so he heard it, but he wasn't formally educated in it. The source text actually pulls direct quotes from Ahmad's own writings to show how absurd these claims were.
What kind of phrases did he claim were divine?
He claimed God revealed phrases to him like, I love you, I am with you, I shall help you, and the famously grammatically confusing, I can what I will do.
I can what I will do?
Yeah.
I mean, that sounds exactly like someone who doesn't speak English trying to translate a profound thought word for word using a pocket dictionary.
And the Orthodox scholars are looking at this, holding it up against the linguistic perfection of the Quran and saying, you expect us to believe the creator of the universe struggles with basic English syntax.
It gets stranger, doesn't it?
It does. The source points out that Ahmed claims the angel who delivered these English revelations didn't look like a traditional, terrifying, multi-winged biblical angel.
Oh boy.
He claimed the angel appeared to him in the form of a young English boy sitting at a desk on a chair.
A young British colonial boy at a desk. Let's just pause and analyze the psychology of that for a second.
It's fascinating.
He is living under the total domination of the British Empire. The bureaucracy, the magistrates, the power, it's all held by the British.
Right.
You can completely see why an Orthodox text would view this as a massive subconscious tell. His brain equates ultimate power with the British colonial administration.
So when he hallucinates or fabricates an angel, it literally takes the form of an English bureaucrat.
Exactly. The author of the critique argues exactly that point.
They suggest these revelations prove one of two things. Either he was suffering from a deep psychological delusion, heavily influenced by his colonial environment, or he was deliberately fabricating these experiences to impress his rural followers, trying to show them he had a universal connection that transcended local languages.
But he doesn't just keep these linguistic salads to himself. The source notes that he actually weaponized them. He challenged the traditional scholars.
He did. He issued open challenges. He would publish a paragraph of his revelations, often a messy blend of Arabic, Persian, and Urdu, and dare the greatest scholars of the day to produce anything like it.
He claimed it was a miraculous sign, mirroring the Quran's challenge to produce a chapter like it.
And the source provides an example of one of these miraculous, unbeatable sentences he wrote.
Oh, I have to hear this.
He claimed God revealed, "Flee from the table of God and its loaves, and the table remained in its place, and they preferred the porridge of the world."
Wait, what does that even mean?
That's exactly the point. Ahmad's challenge was, produce a verse like this if you can. The traditional scholars reading this were completely flabbergasted.
But not because it was profoundly beautiful.
No, the Orthodox source breaks down the grammar and the metaphors, pointing out that it is essentially gibberish. It's a chaotic mixing of metaphors that violates all the rules of classical Arabic eloquence.
It's like someone challenging Shakespeare to a writing contest by slamming their hands on a typewriter and saying, "I bet you can't recreate these exact typos."
That's a perfect analogy. The scholars aren't refusing the challenge because it's too divine. They're refusing it because it's embarrassing.
The critics viewed his challenges as a smokescreen.
He was using aggression to mask the incoherence of his claims. And when the textual challenges didn't convince the scholars, the source notes he started reaching for physical proofs.
Which brings us to the logic of the ring.
Yes, the 30-year-old ring. According to the text, when people demanded a tangible sign of his divine election, Ahmad pointed to his own hand.
He wore a ring that had an Arabic phrase engraved on it, "Is God not sufficient for his servant?"
Which is a very standard, beautiful verse from the Quran.
Very standard. But Ahmad argued that because he had purchased and worn this specific ring for 30 years long, before he ever claimed to be a divine figure, the fact that he possessed a ring with this phrase was a miraculous, undeniable proof that God had chosen him decades ago.
The author of our source text openly ridicules this.
I mean, obviously.
Having a Quranic verse engraved on a ring is an incredibly common cultural practice in the Islamic world. Millions of people wear rings with verses on them.
To take a piece of jewelry you bought 3 decades ago and retroactively claim it is the foundational proof of your prophetic mission shows a profound desperation for legitimacy.
The author argues that true prophets brought undeniable miracles, splitting the sea, healing the sick. Ahmad brought a ring he bought at a market.
It's the logic of a con artist scrambling for props. But if you want to talk about the absolute breaking point for his credibility in the eyes of his critics, it isn't the ring, and it isn't the English-speaking boy angel.
No, it's the Sadullah contradiction.
Exactly. The most devastating causal argument the source text makes against his claim to divine authority. Can you walk us through who Sadullah was?
This is a vital piece of the author's critique because it cuts to the core of what a prophet actually is. In the chaotic world of 19th century religious debates, Ahmed had many fierce rivals who publicly mocked him.
And one of the most prominent was this man named Sadullah.
Right. Ahmed claimed that the situation became so dire that God intervened directly. Ahmed announced that he had received a definitive divine revelation, a prophecy from the Almighty, stating that Sadullah was going to die as a punishment for his opposition.
A classic prophetic smiting prediction. God has told me my enemy will fall. It's a power move to terrify your critics.
Precisely. It's meant to project ultimate, untouchable authority. However, there was a massive problem.
According to the source text, which quotes Ahmad's own subsequent explanations, Ahmad admitted that he intentionally hid this specific divine revelation for a period of time.
He didn't publish it immediately.
And why did he hide the direct infallible word of the Creator?
Because of his lawyer.
Wait, his lawyer?
Ahmed admitted that his legal agent warned him about the local British colonial administration. The lawyer essentially said, if you publish a document predicting the imminent death of a specific rival, the British magistrate is going to interpret that as a death threat.
Wow.
They will arrest you for inciting violence, disturbing the peace, and violating the colonial penal code. So, Ahmed suppressed the prophecy until he felt it was legally safe.
Let me stop you right there, because we have to fully absorb the logical collapse happening here. He is claiming to be the singular mouthpiece of the Almighty on earth.
Right.
He is receiving direct mandates from the Creator of the universe, who is allegedly handing down a death sentence to an enemy.
Right.
But he hits pause on delivering the word of God, because he is afraid of a local colonial police officer.
It is a staggering contradiction.
That is insane. It raises an incredibly damaging question, which the Orthodox source hammers home ruthlessly.
The author uses this exact incident to completely deconstruct the psychology of the movement. The argument is elegantly simple. If these revelations were truly divine, and if Ahmed genuinely, in his heart of hearts, believed he was speaking for God, earthly laws would not force him to suppress the message.
Exactly. If you look at the historical trajectory of anyone who genuinely believes they are a prophet, they don't care about municipal codes.
They face torture, they face lions in the Colosseum, they face crucifixion or exile to deliver the message.
They don't check in with their legal counsel to see if God's wrath complies with Section 4 of the British Penal Code.
Excuse me, Angel Gabriel, my lawyer says we have to delay the smiting until the magistrate is out of town.
It's hilarious, but also so telling.
The source text argues this exposes a deeply pragmatic, almost corporate approach to his prophethood. It shows that, in practice, British colonial law superseded his divine mandate.
So the author argues this is definitive proof that Ahmed knew he was fabricating the revelations.
Yes. He was running a risk-reward calculation, releasing prophecies only when it was politically and legally advantageous, and hiding them when he might face actual consequences.
So, if we look at the timeline so far, he has dodged his Kickstarter investors with terrible math. His divine inspirations are an ungrammatical blender of languages, and he's hiding his prophecies from the local cops.
He has hit a ceiling.
Yeah, being a local debater, or even a guy with some weird visions, isn't enough to give him the ultimate, unquestionable authority he craves. So he needs a new loophole, right?
He needed a massive theological loophole. The local prophecies just weren't working. To elevate himself to the highest possible religious status, he couldn't just add new rules.
He had to fundamentally alter the architecture of the religion itself.
And according to the source material, he found that loophole by executing one of the most audacious theological maneuvers in modern history. He geographically moved the end of the Jesus story.
This is where the theological engineering reaches a whole new level of complexity. To understand why he did this, we really have to look at the standard Orthodox Islamic belief regarding Jesus,
who is known as Isa in the Quran. Orthodox Islamic eschatology holds that Jesus was not crucified and killed on the cross.
Right. Instead, God miraculously raised him up to heaven, physically alive.
And the crucial part of that belief is what happens at the end of the world. The Orthodox belief dictates that in the last days, Jesus will physically return to earth.
Descending from heaven.
Yes, to defeat the Antichrist and restore justice alongside the Mahdi.
So Orthodox Islam has a very specific preordained job opening at the end of the world for the physical return of the historical Jesus.
Correct. But Ghulam Ahmad looks at that job opening, and he wants it for himself. He wants the ultimate title.
The glaring problem is that he is Mirza Ghulam Ahmad from the Punjab. He is clearly not the historical first-century Jesus returning from the sky.
So, according to the source text, Ahmad realizes that to claim the title, he has to completely dismantle the Orthodox belief in the physical return of Jesus.
Because if the physical Jesus is still alive in heaven, waiting to return, Ahmad cannot take his place.
Therefore, Ahmad has to prove, theologically and historically, that Jesus is actually dead.
And he can't just write a pamphlet saying, "Trust me, guys, he passed away." Well, he has to construct an entirely new historical narrative.
He does. He claims to make an earth-shattering historical and geographical discovery. Ahmad declares to the world that he has located the actual physical tomb of Jesus Christ. He points to an existing, well-known tomb in the city of Srinagar, in the region of Kashmir, in northern India. For centuries, this tomb traditionally belonged to a local holy man or saint named Yuz Asaf.
And Ahmad abruptly announces that Yuz Asaf is actually Jesus.
Yes.
The audacity of this is just breathtaking. He doesn't just change a minor rule, he rewrites the physical geography of a major world religion. Let's walk through the exact theological gymnastics he uses to justify this.
Because the source text breaks it down step by step. First, he has to explain how Jesus got to India in the first place.
Right.
Ahmed creates what is known as the swoon theory. He argues that Jesus was put on the cross, but the Orthodox Muslims and the Christians are both wrong about what happened next.
He claims Jesus didn't die on the cross, nor was he raised to heaven.
Instead, he just swooned. He passed out from the excruciating pain and exhaustion, entering a death-like coma.
And then?
He claims Jesus was taken down from the cross alive. His followers treated his massive wounds with a miraculous special ointment.
Which Ahmad conveniently names the ointment of Jesus.
Right. And once he was healed enough to travel, Jesus realized he had to escape the Romans and the authorities in the Middle East. So he fled. He traveled east, embarking on a massive journey along the Silk Road all the way to India.
But why India? Why Kashmir?
Ahmad claimed that Jesus went to India to preach to the lost tribes of Israel, whom Ahmad asserted had settled in the Kashmir Valley.
Okay, and according to this new timeline, what happens to him there?
Jesus lived a long, peaceful life in Kashmir, reaching the ripe old age of 120. He died a completely natural death and was buried in that exact tomb in Srinagar under the name Yuz Asaf.
Okay, let's pause and trace the massive theological domino effect this creates, because it is structurally brilliant in a highly manipulative way.
Oh, absolutely.
If Jesus survived the crucifixion, fled to India, died of old age, and his physical body is currently rotting in a stone tomb in Kashmir, then the Orthodox belief that his physical living body is up in heaven is totally false.
That is domino number one.
And if his physical body is dead and buried on earth, then all those prophecies in the holy texts about the return of the Messiah in the last days cannot possibly refer to the physical return of the historical man.
Because the original body is gone.
Exactly.
Domino number two. Therefore, Ahmad argues, the return prophesied in the text must be interpreted metaphorically. It cannot be a physical return. It must be a spiritual return.
A reincarnation of Jesus' spirit, his qualities, and his role in the form of an entirely new person.
And right as that final domino falls, creating this massive, empty job description for a spiritual return of Jesus, Ahmad steps right into the vacancy.
He essentially created the problem, engineered the historical loophole, and then announced that he was the only logical solution.
It is a textbook hostile takeover of a theological concept. By declaring that the Messiah must be a spiritual successor rather than the original person, he immediately inserts himself into the narrative.
He declares that he is the Mujaddid, the divinely appointed renewer of the 14th Islamic century. He declares he is the promised Mahdi.
And the absolute pinnacle of his claims, he declares that he is the spiritual reincarnation of Jesus. He is the promised Messiah.
It's like a lawyer finding a jurisdictional loophole in a multi-thousand-year-old divine contract and using it to inherit the estate.
That's a great way to put it.
But you have to imagine the reaction of the traditional Muslims. They have believed for over a millennium that Jesus is alive in heaven. Suddenly this guy from Qadiyani is telling them, no, he's dead in a tomb a few hundred miles away, and by the way, I'm him.
Right.
How on earth did he justify this without losing every single follower he had?
This is where the source text highlights a fascinating and highly controversial secondary defense. This defense was actually crystallized and heavily promoted later by Ahmad's son and successor, a man named Bashir Mahmud.
Okay, what was his argument?
When Orthodox scholars mercilessly attacked the Ahmadiyya movement, saying, "You are denying the clear, accepted texts that say Jesus was raised to heaven," Bashir Mahmud flipped the argument completely.
He didn't just argue history, did he?
No, he appealed directly to the deep emotional devotion Muslims have for the Prophet Muhammad.
How do you use devotion to Muhammad to prove Jesus is dead in Kashmir?
Bashir Mahmud argued that the Orthodox belief that Jesus is still alive in heaven is actually a deeply offensive insult to the Prophet Muhammad.
Wait, an insult?
His logic was highly manipulative but emotionally potent. He said to the Orthodox scholars, "We all agreed that the Prophet Muhammad is the greatest of all prophets, the absolute seal of the prophets, the most beloved by God."
Right, that's standard Orthodox belief.
Yet we all know the Prophet Muhammad died a physical death, and his physical body is buried in the dust of the earth in Medina.
Okay.
How can it be, Mahmud argued, that the greatest prophet is buried in the dirt, while a supposedly lesser prophet, Jesus, gets the ultimate privilege of living forever alive in the heavens?
Oh, wow.
He claimed that traditional Orthodox eschatology inadvertently elevated Jesus above Muhammad. Therefore, he argued, if you truly love and honor the Prophet Muhammad, you must accept that Jesus is also dead and buried on earth, just like him.
To believe otherwise is to disrespect the seal of the prophets.
Exactly.
That is incredibly dark emotional manipulation. He takes the genuine, deep reverence that everyday Muslims have for the Prophet Muhammad and weaponizes it against their own traditional theology.
He makes them feel guilty for believing what they've always believed.
How does the Orthodox source text rebut that specific argument? Because that is a really hard emotional trap to escape.
The Orthodox source attacks this rebuttal fiercely, calling it a deceitful emotional sleight of hand. The author points out the fatal flaw in the logic.
Which is?
The source states that in Islamic theology, heaven and earth both belong entirely to God. Being physically located in one or the other does not inherently dictate your spiritual rank or worth.
So location doesn't equal promotion.
Exactly. God has specific plans and different miracles for different prophets, and those unique miracles do not equate to insults against others.
That makes sense.
The source text points out a glaring counterexample. If physical location in heaven means you are superior, then every single angel currently residing in heaven would be spiritually superior to the Prophet Muhammad and all the prophets who lived on earth.
And that is a concept that all of Islam completely rejects, right? Prophets rank higher than angels.
Always. The author emphasizes that Ahmad and his successors systematically manipulated Orthodox eschatology, taking genuine religious sentiments and twisting the logic until it served only one purpose, legitimizing Ghulam Ahmad's claim to power.
You create the crisis, you rewrite the history, you emotionally manipulate the objectors, and the solution is always, well, you.
Always.
But here is the terrifying thing about the architecture of belief he is building. Having successfully claimed the titles of the promised Messiah and the Mahdi, he realized he couldn't hit the brakes.
He was on an escalator of divine claims.
If you claim to be the spiritual reincarnation of Jesus, you can't just go back to writing regular pamphlets. The progression demanded he go further. He had to transition from being a partial prophet to the ultimate universal figure.
Which brings us to the final, most expansive phase of his escalation, as detailed in the 4th section of our source text. We move into the early 1900s. The timeline of his claims accelerates dramatically.
Right, let's track this exact timeline. Because up until about 1900 or 1901, Ahmad had been playing a very careful linguistic game.
He had been using these qualifying terms. He called himself a Nabi Inakis, which means a partial prophet.
Right.
Or a Zili Nabi, which means a shadow prophet or a reflection of a prophet.
He was trying to soften the blow. He knew Orthodox Muslims believed the Prophet Muhammad was the final prophet, so he was essentially saying, I'm not a new prophet, I'm just a shadow of the old ones.
He was testing the waters, pushing the boundaries of the theology without breaking the dam completely.
But around 1901, the source text documents a massive shift. Ahmad drops the humble qualifiers. The shadow and partial titles just disappear.
He officially and explicitly declares himself a full independent prophet.
He crosses the Rubicon.
And he adds a massive, terrifying condition to this new status. He issues a declaration that anyone in the world who has heard his message and does not explicitly pledge allegiance to him is a disbeliever, a sinner destined for hell.
He essentially excommunicates the entire global Muslim population that doesn't follow a guy in rural Punjab.
Yes. But the source text points out a fascinating, almost paradoxical detail about this final transition to full prophethood. Normally, in the history of religions, when someone claims to be a brand new prophet bringing a new divine dispensation, you would expect them to change the core creed of the religion to include themselves.
In Islam, the fundamental declaration of faith, the Shahada, is there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the messenger of Allah.
Right. If you are starting a new movement and you are the new prophet, logic dictates you would update the creed. You would expect his followers to start saying, there is no God but Allah, and Ghulam Ahmed is the messenger of Allah.
Exactly. That is what the Orthodox scholars expected. But Ahmad's followers didn't change it. They kept reciting the exact traditional Shahada.
And the reason why they kept it, according to the source, is truly mind-bending. When Ahmad was challenged on this, he claimed that he didn't need to change the name Muhammad in the Declaration of Faith because he was the second coming of the Prophet Muhammad.
I just need a second to process the sheer magnitude of that claim. He didn't just claim to be a prophet who came after Muhammad. He claimed to literally be Muhammad returning.
Yes. He argued that the spiritual essence, the prophetic light of Muhammad, had reincarnated or perfectly manifested within him. He claimed that his spiritual name was also Muhammad.
So when his followers stood in prayer and said, Muhammad is the messenger, they weren't just referring to the historical man in 7th century Arabia.
No, they were actually referring to him, Mirza Ghulam Ahmed, right there in the 20th century.
He hacked the central code of the religion. And the source text lists the staggering implications of this claim. Because if he is Muhammad, then everything associated with him gets upgraded to the highest holy status.
He claimed that because he was the reincarnation, his grave in India would be equal in holiness to the prophet's grave in Medina.
He claimed his local village of Qadiyani was equal in sanctity to the holy city of Mecca.
He wasn't just taking over a title. He was taking the entire sacred geography, the historical identity, and the spiritual monopoly of Islam, and completely copy-pasting it onto himself in the Punjab.
It is the absolute peak of theological absorption. But here's where it gets really interesting, and where the source text points out the ultimate fatal contradiction in his strategy.
Oh, the Krishna claim.
Yes. He is absorbing all the Islamic titles. He has absorbed the Christian title of Messiah. But remember the environment we discussed at the beginning. He is living in India.
A country with a massive, overwhelmingly Hindu majority.
Right. If you are claiming to be the universal savior of mankind, the ultimate spiritual authority for the entire globe, you cannot simply ignore the massive demographic you are physically living among. You need them.
So the source text reveals what has to be the most surprising pivot in this entire saga. In 1904, realizing he needed to appeal to the massive Hindu demographic, and specifically to counter the influence of the Arya Samaj, gives a lecture in the city of Snellcote.
And in this lecture, he declares that he is also the prophesied avatar of the Hindu deity Krishna.
It is the ultimate syncretic move. He explicitly states that just as he is the spiritual return of Jesus for the Christians, and the Mahdi and return of Muhammad for the Muslims, he is the promised return of Krishna for the Hindus.
He literally referred to himself as the king of the Aryas. But how does anyone accept this? Let's just look at the basic theological frameworks here.
They are completely opposed.
How can you look a crowd in the eye and claim to be the avatar of Krishna, a deity operating within a deeply polytheistic, dharmic framework of cyclical time and reincarnation, and simultaneously claim to be the second coming of Muhammad, the absolute final prophet of the strictest, most uncompromising monotheistic framework on earth?
You can't. Those two systems aren't just different, they are entirely fundamentally incompatible.
You cannot be both. He is trying to be a religious Swiss Army knife, pulling out whichever blade fits the demographic he is talking to that day.
And that profound, inescapable contradiction is exactly what the Orthodox source text views as the ultimate proof of his delusion and deceit.
The author of the critique argues that this syncretism, this reckless blending of East and West, of absolute monotheism and polytheistic avatars, of Abrahamic linear eschatology with dharmic cyclical concepts, was a highly calculated, albeit logically bankrupt move to consolidate power.
He wasn't building a coherent theology. He was building a demographic coalition.
Precisely. He was operating in a highly divided, tense colonial India, where religious identity was the primary currency of power. By trying to be everything to everyone, the source text points out that he inadvertently proved he was nothing but a brilliant opportunist.
He was casting the widest possible net for followers, for funds, and for influence.
But if you are going to claim to be the savior of 3 different world religions simultaneously, You can't just rely on terrible Arabic grammar, old rings, and a tomb in Kashmir. The burden of proof at that level is astronomical.
He needed something bigger to convince the masses, something undeniable. He needed something cosmic.
Yes, the cosmic proof. This is a very famous incident in the history of the movement, and the source text addresses it head-on because it shows how far he was willing to go to manufacture legitimacy.
In the Islamic month of Ramadan, in the year 1312 of the Hijri calendar, which corresponds to the spring of 1894 AD, a relatively rare astronomical event occurred over India. Both a lunar eclipse and a solar eclipse happened within the exact same month of Ramadan.
Now, eclipses happen. It's orbital in mechanics. It's rare to have both in one month, but it's entirely predictable math.
True. But in the highly superstitious environment of 19th century India, an eclipse was terrifying and profoundly significant, and Ahmed seized upon it instantly.
There were some obscure, weak traditions in Islamic folklore, right?
Yes, not core scripture, but folklore suggesting that a sign of the true Mahdi appearing at the end of times would be eclipses occurring in Ramadan.
So the sky hands him a massive marketing opportunity.
And he takes it. When the eclipses happened in 1894, Ahmed boldly published declarations across the country stating that this celestial event was triggered specifically, exclusively for him.
He claimed it was the ultimate, miraculous, divine endorsement of his mission.
He boasted that God had made the sun and the moon darken for him alone.
Think about the sheer ego required for that statement.
Yeah.
He essentially claimed ownership of the orbital mechanics of the solar system.
He really did.
He looks up at the moon passing in front of the sun, an event driven by gravity and mass over millions of miles, and says, yeah, the creator of the universe did that to validate my Kickstarter campaign, my English-speaking angel boy, and my claim to be Krishna.
The source text uses this exact trajectory to demonstrate what it sees as the unchecked pathology of a false prophet. The author argues that when a charismatic leader is no longer bound by orthodox limits, when they can simply generate brand new revelations to escape any logical corner they paint themselves into, there is absolutely no ceiling to how extreme their claims will become.
The eclipses were just another prop in the play, which brings us to the summary of this astonishing, almost unbelievable trajectory. Let's look at the distance this man traveled in a few decades.
It's a massive distance.
We started this deep dive looking at a local debater who dodged his investors over 45 missing books by arguing that a zero doesn't matter. And from that petty scam, he escalates to literally rewriting the geography of the Jesus story, claiming the physical body is rotting in a tomb in Kashmir just to create a job opening for himself.
He absorbs the identity of Jesus.
Then he claims to be the spiritual reincarnation of the Prophet Muhammad, keeping the creed but making it about himself. He excommunicates anyone who disagrees.
And then, realizing he needs the Hindu majority, he decides he is also the avatar of Krishna.
He caps it all off by claiming he commands the eclipses of the sun and the moon. It truly is a dark masterclass in the rapid, unchecked escalation of a charismatic leader.
And this is the crucial takeaway for us today. While our source text approaches this entirely from a stance of strict orthodox theological refutation, the author's goal is to prove him a heretic, a fraud, and a liar for us. Observing how Ahmed built his framework step by step offers incredible universal insights into how modern religious movements and cults engineer their own legitimacy.
It's the architecture of belief.
Exactly. They never start with the biggest, most absurd claims. If Ahmed had walked into the square in 1880 and said, "I am Krishna and Jesus," he would have been ignored.
They start with a genuine need. In this case, the deep desperation of the Muslim community to defend their faith against colonial and Hindu attacks.
They build a platform of trust. They gather funds. Then they create a theological crisis or a historical loophole.
And finally, they fill that loophole with themselves. It's a formula. And it leaves us with a final thought to mull over. Something for you to take away from this deep dive into the muddy, chaotic waters of 19th century theology.
Think about the sheer, undeniable force of historical timing.
Right. If Mirza Ghulam had lived in a unified, politically stable era, in a society with one dominant, confident worldview, his claims, the bizarre English revelations, the mathematical excuses, the Krishna avatar pivot, they would likely have vanished overnight.
He would have been an eccentric footnote.
But he didn't live in a stable era.
He lived in late 19th century colonial India, a place utterly fractured by British imperialism, traumatized by the Krush Rebellion of 1857, deeply divided by aggressive Christian, Hindu, and Muslim tensions.
You had a massive population that felt completely powerless, culturally erased, and desperate for a unifying, all-powerful savior to make sense of their suffering. He found the perfect incubator.
A society in crisis lowers its immune system against radical claims.
And it makes you wonder about the movements we see rising today. Are these explosive, radical new movements really the product of one person's extraordinary imagination and charisma?
Or are they just a mirror?
Are these leaders simply reflecting the exact anxieties, the deep fractures, and the desperate needs of the society that allows them to grow in the first place? If a society is broken enough, people will follow anyone who confidently claims to have the cure.
It's definitely something to think about.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. Keep questioning the source material, keep looking for the mechanics behind the claims, and we'll see you next time. Imagine the founding father of your nation has just died. Like the entire country is just completely reeling.
Oh, it would be massive. A total national trauma.
Right. Millions of people are in mourning, the streets are filled with grief, and the political future of this brand new state feels, incredibly fragile.
Yeah, that post-independence vulnerability is so real.
Exactly. So state funeral is organized, but then your top foreign minister, one of the most powerful, visible men in the entire government, stands at the funeral and flat out refuses to participate in the prayer for the nation's founder.
Wow. He just stands there.
He just stands there.
Yeah.
Entirely separate from everyone else. And why? Because a religious leader from a small town of the Punjab had declared that anyone outside his highly specific sect was basically an infidel.
It is a moment that perfectly captures the absolute uncompromising reality of an ideological schism.
It really does.
We aren't talking about a mild difference of opinion over a dinner table here. We are talking about a theological wall so high and so rigid that a sitting foreign minister would risk a massive national scandal rather than say a prayer.
A prayer for the father of his own country. Welcome to today's deep dive, everyone.
Glad to be here for this one. It's a heavy topic.
It really is. Today, we are opening up a stack of highly critical source text to track the anatomy of a massive theological and political controversy.
Specifically, we are looking at the Qadiyani or Ahmadiyya movement.
Right. But we aren't just giving you, a standard textbook history of how it started.
No, the sources we're looking at are way more forensic than that.
Exactly. We are tracing how this movement matured, how it built its walls, and how Orthodox Islamic scholars systematically deconstructed its claims over time.
And before we go any further, we really need to explicitly state the nature of our map today for you, the listener.
Yes, the disclaimer. That is crucial.
Because the sources provided for this deep dive are intensely critical. They are penned by scholars who view this movement not merely as, a different denomination.
Right. They see it as a fundamental heresy.
Exactly.
So I want to be perfectly clear with you, the listener. Our mission today is absolutely not to take theological sides.
Or political ones, for that matter.
Right. We aren't here to endorse the religious viewpoints of the Orthodox scholars, nor are we here to condemn the faith of the movement's followers. We are just acting purely as your guides through the source material.
We are objectively examining exactly what these authors argue, the historical evidence they bring to the table, and the psychological mechanisms they describe.
We are basically analyzing the mechanics of belief, authority, and critique. Like, how does a movement insulate itself so completely?
And how do critics attempt to dismantle it? That is our focus.
And what a wild journey these texts lay out for us. We're going to look at shifting claims about DNA and ancient prophecies.
Oh, the shifting lineage stuff is wild.
It is. And we are going to examine botched pre-Islamic poetry presented as divine revelation.
Which is just a fascinating literary disaster, according to the sources.
Absolutely. And we're going to look deeply at heavily documented catastrophic failures in predicting the future, which the texts spend a massive amount of time on.
They really do. But to really grasp how this movement survived all of that, we have to start with that funeral you mentioned.
Right. The Zafullah Khan anecdote.
Yeah. We have to understand how they redrew the boundaries of reality for their followers. Because if you want to build a new world, you first have to convince your followers that the old world is dead.
So true. And the sources detail this massive, deliberate ideological pivot by the founder, Mirza Ghulam Ahmed.
Right, because in his early days, he presented himself simply as a champion of Islam, right?
Yeah, exactly. He was debating Christian missionaries and Hindu reformists. He was the defender.
But as his following grew, the texts show this severe contraction of who was considered, saved.
It's like the circle just got smaller and smaller. Eventually, he decreed that any Muslim who did not accept his specific claims was a kafir, an infidel.
So it's not just we have a slightly better understanding of the texts.
No, it is if you do not follow me, you are entirely outside the fold of the faith. And the texts emphasized that this wasn't just some theoretical label they threw around.
Right, it was a practical daily severance from society.
Exactly. Followers were strictly forbidden from praying behind non-follower Muslims. They couldn't even stand in the same prayer lines.
And it went further than that. They were forbidden from marrying their children into the families of non-followers.
Which is huge. Think about the sociological impact of forbidding intermarriage in 19th and early 20th century India.
I mean, in that culture, marriage is the fundamental glue of society.
Right.
It dictates your economic network, your social safety net, your family's entire standing. By cutting that tie, you are practically demanding social death from your followers.
You are forcing them to rely entirely on the new sect for their survival.
Which brings us perfectly back to that striking anecdote about Zafrullah Khan.
Right. And for those who might not be super familiar with the history of this subcontinent, the man whose funeral he refused to pray at was Muhammad Ali Jinnah.
The Quaid-e-Azam, the literal founder of Pakistan.
Exactly. And Zafrullah Khan was Pakistan's first foreign minister, right? An incredibly prominent follower of the Ahmadiyya movement.
Yes, and the source texts use this specific event to highlight the terrifying power of these new boundaries.
It really shows the grip the doctrine had. When a high-ranking diplomat cannot bring himself to participate in a foundational moment of national mourning.
Because of a sectarian decree, you see the true strength of the indoctrination right there.
But the texts show that the movement went even further than just social isolation. They altered the geographical and temporal reality of their followers.
This is the part that completely blew my mind when we were reading the materials.
Same here. According to the sources, the movement claimed that Qadiyani, which is the small town in India where the founder was born, was spiritually equal to, or even superior to, Mecca and Medina.
They instituted a mandatory pilgrimage to Qadiyani.
Which is wild. Geography is incredibly important to human psychology.
Oh, completely. For over a millennium, the global Muslim community has oriented itself toward Mecca. It is the literal axis of their spiritual world.
So by shifting that axis to a dusty town in the Punjab, you are physically reorienting the believer's mind.
You're pointing them away from the global community and strictly toward the founder.
And then, and this is just brilliant in a dark way, they mess with the clock.
Yes, the calendar shift.
The texts note that they invented a completely new set of months. They threw out the traditional Islamic lunar calendar.
No more Muharram, Safar, or Ramadan.
Right. They replaced them with newly named months like Suth, Tabali, and Aman.
It is a brilliant, if draconian, tactic of control. You are altering how a person experiences time itself.
So it's an infrastructural isolation. It's not just telling them what to think, it's literally changing the dashboard of how they process a Tuesday.
Exactly. If your Tuesday is suddenly a completely different month than your neighbor's Tuesday, you are no longer living in the same shared reality.
You are living in a walled garden.
A walled garden where the founder holds the only key. And the texts lay this out as the ultimate blueprint for high control groups.
We see this today all the time.
Oh, absolutely. Consider how extreme political factions or modern wellness cults operate right now. They don't start with the wildest claims.
Right. They start by altering your vocabulary. They tell you that your family doesn't truly understand you.
They redefine your media consumption. And by the time they introduce the truly radical ideas, you have no external support system left to pull you back to reality.
But here is the fascinating paradox the source is present. By burning all these bridges with mainstream Muslims, by calling everyone else an infidel, and retreating into this alternate reality.
They found themselves entirely isolated locally.
Yes. Yet that very isolation made them incredibly attractive to some highly unexpected, powerful friends on the global stage.
This is where theology collides head-on with pure, realpolitik in the sources.
And it is fascinating. The critical sources assert that the movement's radical separation from mainstream Islam garnered enthusiastic support from two entities you would never, ever expect.
Hindu nationalists and later the State of Israel.
When I read that in the texts, I had to physically stop and reread it.
It's a massive claim.
Hindu nationalists and the State of Israel heavily supporting an ostensibly Islamic sect born in a Punjabi village. It sounds completely counterintuitive.
It does.
Why on earth would these foreign or competing political powers care about the theological claims of Mirza Ghulam Ahmed?
Because they didn't care about the theology. The authors of our source texts argue forcefully that this was an alliance of pure, cold strategy.
Strategy based on what?
It all hinged on one specific theological innovation by the founder, the abolition of jihad as armed resistance.
Okay, we need to unpack the historical weight of that for the listener.
Yeah, context is everything here.
So Mirza Ghulam Ahmed declares that fighting against colonial rulers, specifically the British Empire at the time, is spiritually forbidden. He tells his followers that God commands them to lay down their arms and be loyal subjects to the crown.
To understand why that is so geopolitically explosive, you have to look at the era. We are talking about post-1857 India.
The Sepoy Mutiny, or the First War of Independence, depending on your historical lens.
Exactly. That event had deeply traumatized the British Empire. They suddenly realized how vastly outnumbered they were on the subcontinent.
Right. The financial and military cost of policing a restive, armed, and furious population was astronomical.
So if you are the British viceroy and a local religious leader suddenly emerges,
who uses the vocabulary of the divine to tell millions of potential rebels that shooting at British soldiers is a sin that will send them to hell.
I mean, that theology is worth 10 divisions of infantry.
Absolutely. The sources claim the British actively nurtured the movement for this exact reason. A pacified populace is a profitable populace.
But the texts show this utility extended far beyond just the British. Let's look at the Hindu nationalist perspective cited in the material.
This was equally surprising to me.
The texts quote Dr. Shankar Das Mehra, a very prominent Hindu nationalist leader, and he explicitly celebrated the movement.
Why? What was his reasoning?
Because it shifted the Muslim focus from an Arab-centric worldview to an Indian-centric one.
Ah, I see. Because mainstream Islam is inherently global, right?
Yeah.
Its emotional and spiritual core is in the Middle East.
Right. So if you are an Indian nationalist who views pan-Islamic unity as a threat to the political consolidation of India, you want to break that external tie.
Precisely the argument the sources make. Dr. Mehra is quoted noting that every time a Muslim converts to this new movement, their spiritual loyalty to Arab civilization weakens.
Their reverence is recentered on the Indian town of Qadiyani instead of Mecca.
Even Jawaharlal Nehru, according to the text, defended the movement against Orthodox Islamic scholars.
Because he recognized that this internal sectarian fracture effectively neutralized a unified Muslim political bloc within India.
Divide and conquer, facilitated by a new calendar and a new holy city.
Exactly. And the sources take this exact same logic of strategic fragmentation and apply it to the Middle East later on.
Right. They detail how the movement established a massive, highly active center in Haifa, Israel.
And this wasn't some small basement operation either. The texts describe a really significant footprint.
A mosque, a library, and the publication of a magazine called Al-Bushra, right?
Yes, which was then distributed to 30 different Arab countries.
And the critics argue that the State of Israel facilitated this for the exact same reason the British did in India.
Yes, that's the core argument in the source material. If a movement can successfully convince segments of the Arab population to abandon armed resistance
and simultaneously break Orthodox Arab Islamic unity,
it acts as a phenomenal geopolitical shield. It neutralizes ideological and physical opposition to national interests without firing a single shot.
But here's the catch. With acting as a geopolitical shield for external powers, your local followers are eventually going to notice the friction.
Oh, absolutely. You can't hide that kind of alignment forever.
Right. To keep your domestic base completely entranced while your movement makes these massive, pragmatic political maneuvers, you need an airtight, undeniable aura of divine authority.
You need a backstory that makes you totally untouchable.
And that is where the source texts reveal a fascinating, almost comical identity crisis.
The shifting lineage.
Yes. If you're going to present yourself as a universal savior to a diverse global audience, your origin story has to do a lot of heavy lifting.
And the critical sources highlight severe, documented contradictions in Mirza Ghulam Ahmad's claims about his own ancestry.
It's honestly like downloading an ancestry app, taking a DNA test, and then furiously hacking the app to change your genetic makeup every time you walk into a different room.
Just to impress whoever's standing there at the time.
Exactly. Let's look at the menu of lineages the texts lay out. Where does he start?
Well, initially, his family claimed to be Mughal, specifically from the Barlas tribe.
Which contextually makes perfect sense for where he lived.
Rare. Absolutely. In 19th century India, claiming Mughal heritage was the ultimate social flex.
They were the historical ruling class, the empire builders.
Right. Claiming that bloodline grants you immediate, localized prestige and authority among the people in the Punjab.
But local prestige only gets you so far if you are aiming for, universal divine validation.
Right. The local flex doesn't translate to global prophecy.
So the sources show that suddenly the story changes. He announces that a divine revelation has informed him that his true lineage is actually Persian.
And why Persian?
The sources explain this perfectly, because there's a very specific, well-known, and highly respected Orthodox Islamic prophecy.
It states that even if faith were suspended at the Pleiades, the star cluster, a man of Persian descent would reach it and bring it back to Earth.
So it's basically a resume requirement for the job he wants.
Exactly. He wants to be recognized by mainstream scholars as this prophesied savior, but he can't do that if he's a mogul.
So, a new revelation drops, and poof, his bloodline is retroactively Persian.
But the elasticity of his narrative, according to the texts, doesn't stop there. He also wants to appeal to the deep mystical traditions of Sufism.
Oh, the Ibn Arabi connection.
Yes. The texts point out that he heavily referenced the famous Sufi mystic and philosopher Ibn Arabi.
Let's explain Ibn Arabi for the listener, just to set the stakes. This isn't just some random guy. This is one of the most towering intellectual and spiritual figures in Islamic history.
If Ibn Arabi made a prediction, the mystical community paid very close attention.
Exactly. And Ibn Arabi had prophesied that in the end times, a Chinese boy would be born who would act as a catalyst for spiritual revival.
So, to cast his net over the Sufi demographic, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad suddenly claims that his origins were actually Chinese.
I mean, you kind of have to admire the sheer audacity of it.
It's definitely bold.
He's trying to be the promised figure for the Persians, the mystical Chinese savior for the Sufis, and the historical aristocrat for the Indian locals all at once.
But the texts highlight one final massive hurdle he had to clear. The ultimate title, the Mahdi.
Right. The Mahdi is the eschatological redeemer of Islam, the figure who arrives at the end of times to restore justice.
But in Islamic eschatology, the Mahdi isn't just a generic savior. Tradition holds overwhelmingly that he must specifically be a direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad through his daughter, Fatima.
So claiming Fatimid lineage isn't just a bonus point, it is a mandatory prerequisite for the job description.
Without that specific bloodline, Orthodox scholars wouldn't even let you in the room to make your case.
So right on cue, as the critical sources document, another revelation arrives.
He claims that through one of his grandmothers, he actually possesses Fatimid lineage. He is now part of the Prophet's family.
From Mughal to Persian to Chinese to Fatimid. The critics in our source texts argue that this isn't proof of divine universalism.
No, they see it as glaring proof of fraudulent fabrication.
You can't be all things to all people without eventually contradicting biological and historical reality.
And the critics use this to paint a picture of a man desperately throwing theological spaghetti at the wall to see what sticks.
But this chaotic approach wasn't limited to his family tree, was it?
Not at all. The sources document that it bled directly into the very core of his religious authority. The actual words he claimed were being spoken to him by God.
Which brings us to the Tadkira.
Yes. The book compiled by the movement that contains his claimed wahi, or divine revelations.
Now, if someone tells you they are the direct mouthpiece of the creator of the universe, communicating urgent instructions to humanity, you expect a certain level of profundity.
You expect transcendent clarity.
At the absolute minimum, you expect grammatical coherence.
But the deep dive into the Tadkira, provided by our critical sources, reveals what they describe as a linguistic car crash.
The texts document that these revelations were a dizzying mix of Arabic, English, Urdu, and Persian.
And he wasn't just alternating languages day by day, which might make some sense. He was mashing them together into single sentences.
The critics argue this wasn't some elegant polyglot poetry meant to show dominion over all tongues.
Far from it. It included phrases of absolute gibberish. The sources highlight sentences that the founder himself admitted he couldn't fully translate or explain.
The most famous example cited in the text is his claim to have received the revelation. Eli lama sabatani. Eli os.
Okay, let's break that phrase down for the listener.
Yeah, please do.
The first part sounds like a clumsy echo of the biblical phrase spoken by Jesus on the cross. Eli, lema sabachthani.
Meaning, my God, why have you forsaken me?
Exactly, but it's butchered in the text. And then he tacks on Eli Oz at the end. What does that even mean?
According to the critics, it means absolutely nothing. It is contextually meaningless.
And if we look at the psychology the critics are suggesting here, this is the hallmark of someone attempting to manufacture an aura of mysticism.
Right. By stringing together broken bits of holy languages, a little Aramaic to sound like Jesus, some Arabic for Islamic legitimacy.
And a dash of English because it was the language of the colonial masters. He is trying to project esoteric universal knowledge.
It really reminds me of someone trying to sound like an intellectual powerhouse at a dinner party by quoting philosophers they've never actually read.
Oh, totally. They just memorize a few out-of-context quotes from Nietzsche and Kant and mash them together.
Hoping nobody at the table actually has a philosophy degree. But the stakes here aren't a dinner party. The stakes are a claim to divine prophethood.
And the sources detail an instance where this strategy spectacularly publicly backfired.
The Labid poetry incident.
Yes, this is presented in the text as a devastating blow to his credibility.
So he claimed to receive a majestic, brand new divine revelation in Arabic. He published it for his followers.
But Orthodox scholars who were deeply educated in classical Arabic literature took one look at it and recognized it immediately.
Because it wasn't a divine revelation at all. It was a direct line from the famous pre-Islamic poet Labid.
Exactly. And for context, Labid is one of the foundational figures of classic Arabic poetry. His work is studied by anyone learning the language's history.
The specific line was about the arrows of death, right?
Yes. It's basically the equivalent of someone today standing up, claiming God just revealed a brand new, never-before-heard truth to them, and then solemnly reciting, to be or not to be, that is the question.
Everyone would just stare at them like, that's Shakespeare, buddy.
Exactly. And to add insult to injury, the sources point out that when he plagiarized this famous poem, he actually got the grammar wrong.
He misquoted it.
He did. From the perspective of the critics writing these texts, this is definitive proof of falsehood.
Because in Islamic theology, true divine revelation, like the Quran, is considered perfect and inimitable.
Right. So a botched, grammatically incorrect plagiarism of a poet who lived before Islam even existed is, to the critics, the ultimate exposure of a charlatan.
But I want to push on this a little bit. Plagiarism and weird linguistic mashups might destroy your literary reputation among highly educated scholars.
Sure.
But the average follower in a Punjabi village might not know who Labid is. They might not know Aramaic.
That's a very fair point.
What they do understand, however, are concrete predictions about their own lives and their own towns.
And this is where the source texts become incredibly empirical. This brings us to what I consider the most crucial section of the critical material we are examining today.
The hazards of prophecy.
Yes, because here the critique moves from literary analysis into verifiable historical data.
The sources meticulously document a series of highly specific bets the founder made about the future. And according to the texts, these weren't vague metaphorical bets, they were binary.
Right. When a cult leader says a great spiritual awakening is coming next year, that's safe.
Very safe. If people feel good next year, he takes the credit. If they don't, she says they didn't pray hard enough. It's a non-falsifiable claim.
But Mirza Ghulam Ahmed, according to our texts, didn't play it safe. He made highly specific, testable predictions with strict deadlines.
Let's really dive deep into these because the sources dedicate a massive amount of ink to this. Let's start with the Christian opponent.
Okay. The texts detail how Mirza Ghulam Ahmed was engaged in a fierce public debate with a specific Christian missionary.
Abdullah Otham. Yeah.
Yes. To prove his divine backing, he publicly predicted the exact time frame for this specific opponent's death.
He staked his claim to absolute truth on the premise that God would strike this man down within a set window of months.
It's the ultimate theological mic drop. I'm right, you're wrong, and God will kill you by Tuesday to prove it.
But what happened?
The deadline came and went. The man outlived the prediction entirely.
Okay, so that's a massive strike one.
Okay.
But the texts dedicate even more attention to an even more localized, deeply personal prophecy.
The saga of Muhammadi Begum.
We really need to spend some time dissecting this, because the sources use it as the prime, undeniable example of his prophetic failure. Who was she, and what exactly was the prediction?
Muhammadi Begum was a young woman related to Mirza Ghulam Ahmad's extended family. The sources detail how he suddenly announced a divine prophecy that he was destined to marry her.
He claimed God had ordained this union in the heavens, right?
Yes. But there was a massive real-world obstacle.
A huge one. She was already married. Or, depending on the exact timeline of his various proclamations, she was betrothed and then quickly married to someone else.
Right. Her family rejected his proposal and married her to a man named Sultan Muhammad.
But the prophecy didn't stop there. He didn't just accept the rejection.
No, he doubled down. He further predicted that her new husband would die within a specific time frame, usually cited as 2.5 years.
And he claimed that this death would clear the way for this divinely mandated marriage to take place.
Put yourself in the shoes of that local community for a second. This isn't abstract theology being debated in a library.
No, this is a local leader publicly declaring that a specific woman in their social circle is going to become a widow by divine decree so he can marry her.
The societal tension, the gossip, the fear, it must have been absolutely suffocating for her family.
And again, he put a ticking clock on it. He bound his own credibility to the death of this man and the subsequent marriage.
But the texts document the outcome plainly. The husband did not die within the predicted time frame.
He lived a long life.
Yes, Mohammadi Begum remained married to him. The divinely ordained marriage to Mirza Ghulam Ahmed never, ever occurred.
And the texts hammer this point home because it was so public and so drawn out.
And according to the sources, these empirical failures extended directly into his own household, too.
Right, the predictions about his own children. He confidently predicted the birth of a male heir.
He claimed divine insight that a son was coming.
And his wife gave birth to a daughter.
Which, again, is a binary failure. But the most tragic documentation of these failed predictions involves his son, Mubarak Ahmad. What happened there?
This one is just sad. He prophesied that this boy, Mubarak Ahmad, would grow up to be a monumental figure, a great world-changing reformer with a massive spiritual destiny.
He set the expectation that this child was central to the future of the entire movement.
Tragically, the child fell ill and passed away at the age of 8.
Okay, I have to stop and ask the obvious question here. I am trying to put myself in the mind of a follower in that era.
Yeah, let's look at it from the ground level.
I have watched the Christian missionary outlive the death curse. I have watched Mohammadi Begum stay happily married to her living husband. I have seen the promised son turn out to be a daughter, and I have watched the supposedly world-changing reformer tragically die as a child.
Got a brutal track record.
When you make concrete bets about the future and you lose repeatedly, in public, with tragic consequences, why doesn't the movement just evaporate?
Right. Why didn't everyone just pack up their bags, realize they'd been duped, and go back to their mainstream mosques?
Because you are assuming human beings process belief logically. The source texts actually provide a brilliant window into why they stayed by diving into the psychology of high-control groups.
They discuss the sunk cost fallacy, don't they?
Extensively. The critics actually quote a leader of the Lahori faction, which was a major offshoot of the movement, who was pressed on these glaring, undeniable failures.
What was his defense? How do you defend the Mohammadi Begum failure?
The leader essentially justified the failures by arguing, you cannot reject a man for one false prophecy when other prophecies came true.
Wow. They literally just moved the goalposts.
Completely. Ignore the 5 times he was demonstrably wrong about life and death, and focus on the time he vaguely predicted a good harvest or an earthquake.
It is the ultimate manifestation of the sunk cost fallacy. Remember what we discussed at the very beginning of this deep dive?
The social isolation?
Exactly. By the time a follower realizes a prophecy, like Mohammadi Begum's marriage has failed, what has that follower already sacrificed?
Everything. They've accepted the decree that their non-follower parents are kafirs.
They've stopped praying with their old community. They've abandoned their traditional calendar.
They've shifted their spiritual compass from Mecca to Qadiyani. They have invested their entire social, financial, and psychological identity into this alternate reality.
So, to look at the failed prophecy and admit he was wrong requires them to simultaneously admit, I destroyed my relationship with my family for nothing. I changed my entire life for a lie.
And the human brain is designed to protect us from that level of psychological devastation.
So cognitive dissonance acts as a shield. The brain invents a rationale to protect the ego.
They start saying things like, well, the prophecy of the husband's death was metaphorical.
Or God delayed the punishment because they secretly repented.
Or the prophecy was a test of our faith, not a literal prediction of an event.
Precisely the mechanisms the critics outline. The texts show how followers are systematically conditioned to ignore empirical external reality and focus entirely on the internal self-justifying logic of the group.
The more the outside world proves them wrong, the more they retreat into the safety of the walled garden.
It is a deeply sobering psychological reality. But the authors of our source material saved their most devastating critique for last.
They really do build to a climax here.
Because according to these texts, the most glaring, undeniable contradiction wasn't a failed prediction about the future. It was a complete, documented contradiction of his own past.
Which brings us to the theological core of the source material, the issue of the seal of the prophets.
For listeners who might not be steeped in Islamic theology, we really need to explain the concept of Khatam and Nabiyan, or the seal of the prophets.
Yes, because this isn't a fringe idea. It is the absolute bedrock of Orthodox Islamic consensus.
It is the belief that the Prophet Muhammad was the final prophet sent by God to humanity, and that the door of divine revelation is permanently closed.
Think of it like the seal on a legal contract. Once the wax is stamped, the document is finalized. Nobody can add an addendum. Nobody can tamper with the text.
If someone claims they can break the seal and add new clauses, the entire contract is voided.
To Orthodox Muslims, claiming prophethood after Muhammad is not just a disagreement, it is an attempt to shatter the foundational contract of the faith.
And what the critical sources do here is devastatingly simple, and frankly, brilliant from a debate perspective.
They use his own words against him.
Yes, they don't just use external Orthodox scholars to attack Mirza Ghulam Ahmad. They use Mirza Ghulam Ahmad's own early writings to destroy his later claims.
The texts meticulously document his early career. When he was first building his platform, positioning himself merely as a defender of Islam against the onslaught of Christian missionaries and Hindu reformists,
he vehemently, passionately defended the Orthodox concept of the seal of the prophets.
The sources quote him directly. He called the idea that any prophet could come after Muhammad disrespectful, audacious, and untrue.
He explicitly stated in his published works that the door of revelation was firmly and permanently closed.
He went so far as to write that anyone claiming prophethood after Muhammad was a liar, a heretic, and outside the fold of Islam.
He wrote the exact parameters that would later condemn him, because years later, after he'd gathered a massive following,
after the British found his pacifist theology useful, after he had isolated his believers with new calendars and kafir decrees,
he claimed to be exactly what he had previously condemned, a new prophet, receiving direct, ongoing revelation from God.
The sources trace this evolution step by step, presenting it as a masterclass in the psychology of gradual indoctrination.
It's the software update analogy.
Oh, I like that. Explain that.
It's like downloading a simple, helpful flashlight app on your phone. You agree to the terms because it's just a flashlight.
Right, it's harmless.
But over 10 years of mandatory gradual updates, it slowly rewrites its own permissions. First, it asks for your location, then your contacts, then your camera.
Until one day, it's quietly operating your microphone and draining your bank accounts.
Exactly. The user agreed to the flashlight on day one. They never would have agreed to this surveillance if it was presented up front. How do the texts map out his specific updates?
Well, the sources actually break it down into 4 distinct phases of escalation because, you don't start a movement by walking into a village square and declaring you are a prophet.
Right. People will dismiss you as insane or worse.
Exactly. So you start with phase 1, the defender. You identify an external threat like colonial missionaries, and you position yourself as the ultimate Orthodox champion of the established faith. You gain widespread trust.
You are the flashlight app. Safe, useful, Orthodox.
Right. Then phase 2, the reformer, or mujaddid. You tell your now loyal followers that the faith has been corrupted by traditional scholars over the centuries, and God has chosen you to clean it up. You start introducing slight variations in interpretation.
This is where you ask for access to the contacts. It's a bit of an overreach, but the followers trust you because you defended them in phase 1.
Exactly. Then comes phase 3, the messianic claim. You announce you are the promised Mahdi, or the metaphorical return of Jesus. You elevate yourself from a smart scholar to a divinely ordained eschatological figure.
And crucially, as the texts point out, this is the phase where you institute the massive social isolation.
Yes. This is when you declare mainstream Muslims are kafirs. This is when you change the calendar and demand pilgrimage to Qadiyani.
You lock the doors. Your base is now completely isolated, alienated from their families, entirely devoted and utterly dependent on you for their worldview.
They have nowhere else to go. Only then, once the trap is sprung, do you execute phase 4. You cross the final theological line. You declare yourself a prophet.
The flashlight app now owns your phone. By the time the followers realize the massive contradiction, by the time they look at his new claims and compare them to the books he wrote 20 years earlier calling such claims heresy, they are in too deep to turn back.
Their cognitive dissonance won't let them process the contradiction.
And that is the ultimate argument that critical sources are making. They frame this theological flip-flop not merely as an innocent evolution of thought.
No, they see it as a calculated, predatory deception designed to slowly consolidate absolute, unquestionable power over a captive audience.
Think about how deeply relevant the architecture of that deception is to us today, listening to this right now. Reflect on how often we see this exact pattern in modern leaders outside of religion.
It happens constantly in politics and tech.
Right. Think about a tech CEO who builds a massive platform by aggressively championing open source software and total data privacy. They gain millions of loyal users based on that strict ethical promise.
But the moment they achieve a monopoly, the moment the users are locked into the ecosystem and it's too difficult to leave, they completely flip the script.
They lock down the code, sell the user data, and betray the foundational promise. Or a politician who builds a grassroots movement on strict constitutional limitations of power, only to completely rewrite the rules of governance and expand executive overreach the second they win the highest office.
They build trust on one set of rigid principles, and once the base is locked in and isolated in their echo chamber, they completely contradict their own foundation.
It's the universal playbook of absolute authority.
Yeah.
What the sources reveal is that the mechanics of capturing human loyalty haven't changed in over a century. Only the vocabulary has.
So true.
Let's pull back and summarize the massive journey we've taken through this dense, highly critical segment of our source material today.
We covered a lot of ground.
We really did.
Yeah.
We started by looking at the calculated infrastructural isolation of a community. We saw how a leader redrew the boundaries of reality, excommunicating mainstream believers, forbidding marriages, and psychologically severing ties through the invention of new calendars and the relocation of the Holy Center to Qadiyani.
We then explored the geopolitical chessboard. We analyzed the author's claims that the movement's doctrine abolishing armed resistance, jihad made this isolated pacifist sect a highly attractive, pragmatic tool for external powers.
From British colonizers trying to manage a post-1857 India to Hindu nationalists trying to fracture pan-Islamic unity.
To the State of Israel facilitating centers in Haifa to neutralize Arab political cohesion.
We watched the narrative bend and twist with the multiple-choice lineage, the calculated shifts from Mughal prestige to Persian prophecy to the Chinese boy of Sufi mysticism, and finally the Fatimid bloodline required for the Mahdi.
We examined the linguistic chaos of the Tadkira's mixed language revelations and the disastrous plagiarism of pre-Islamic poetry.
And we spent a massive amount of time on the verifiable empirical failures of highly specific prophecies regarding the deaths of rivals, the marriages to specific women, and the births of sons.
And finally, we saw the ultimate documented self-contradiction. A leader who built his initial reputation and trust by vehemently, aggressively defending the finality of prophethood, only to eventually claim that exact forbidden title for himself once his followers were too psychologically and socially indoctrinated to challenge him.
It is a profound, heavy, and frankly troubling look at how belief can be manipulated, mapped out meticulously by the critics in these texts.
And it leaves us with a fascinating, highly provocative thought to mull over as we wrap up today.
What's that?
These sources paint a picture of a movement built in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This was an era where information moved at an absolute crawl.
Right. Books took years to write and publish. Letters took months to cross oceans.
That slow pace of information allowed a charismatic leader the time, and frankly the dark space, to gradually rewrite his own history, adjust his lineage, and completely invert his theology over decades without immediate, widespread detection.
You could tell one village you were Persian and another you were Chinese, and it would take years for them to compare notes.
Exactly. The lag in communication was the shield for the deception.
That makes total sense.
It begs a crucial question for our time. In our modern age of digital permanence, where every tweet, every video clip, every public statement is archived, instantly searchable, and cross-referenced forever, could a charismatic leader pull off this level of extreme historical and ideological shape-shifting today?
You would think it's impossible now. I mean, we have the receipts. Everything is recorded.
But do we use them? Or have we just replaced religious shape-shifting with political and cultural shape-shifting? Do our modern algorithms, which create bespoke digital echo chambers that isolate us just as effectively as changing a physical calendar, actually make it easier for leaders to contradict themselves?
Oh, wow. Because if the algorithm ensures their followers will only ever see the curated, supportive reality the leader provides, it doesn't matter if the contradictory tweet from 5 years ago exists.
The followers will never be shown it. Or if they are, they'll be told it's a deepfake or out of context. It's something for you, the listener, to explore on your own. Are the walls of the garden gone, or are they just digital now?
A diagnostic landscape that is indeed still very murky and incredibly relevant. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the sources today. It's been a massive, fascinating trek through the mechanics of ideology, authority, and critique. We wish you a great rest of your day, and, as always, keep questioning the terrain. Usually medical diagnosis is, well, it's precise, right?
Right, yeah.
Like you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, the doctor points to it, and the reality of the situation is just totally binary.
Broken or not broken.
Exactly. It's
Wow.
clean. And honestly, it is comforting because we really like our structural damage to be visible and easily categorized.
Oh, absolutely. We want a clear picture.
But in the world of 19th century theology and colonialism, that x-ray machine is just fundamentally broken.
Yeah, it really is. It is a diagnostic landscape that redefines murky.
Totally. So today we are taking a deep dive into an orthodox Islamic text that attempts to completely dismantle the founder of the Ahmadiyya movement, Mirza Ghulam Ahmed.
And this text is, it is intense.
Oh, it is wild. Let me tell you, this textual diagnosis involves a literal prayer duel to the death, claims of an angel speaking broken English from a desk chair, and serious accusations of colonial psychological warfare.
Yeah, the source material we are examining today is this highly detailed, deeply structural theological critique. And it is written from a strictly orthodox Islamic perspective. It is basically designed to be the ultimate decisive takedown of the Qadiyani movement.
Which is a term the author uses, right?
Yeah, exactly. Though it is also widely known as the Ahmadiyya movement.
And because this text is just an absolute behemoth, our scope for this deep dive is going to be laser focused.
We have to be, or we would be here for days.
Exactly. We are looking exclusively at the author's concluding arguments.
The final synthesis.
Right, the closing arguments in this sort of theological trial where the author attempts to strip away decades of religious debate.
Just to expose what they believe is the naked, contradictory core of the movement.
Now, before we really get into the anatomy of this argument, we need to establish the ground rules for you, the listener, for this deep dive.
Definitely. This is crucial.
Because this material contains highly charged allegations of heresy, political manipulation, and deep spiritual schisms.
Very heavy stuff.
So we are acting strictly as a neutral mirror here.
Right. We are not taking sides.
Exactly. We are not validating the orthodox critique, nor are we defending the movement.
Our job is simply to impartially unpack the structural arguments, the historical claims, and the theological mechanisms exactly as they are laid out in this specific source text.
We are just analysts examining the architecture of a critique.
And the way the author constructs this final synthesis is fascinating.
How so?
Well, because they do not start by attacking the peripheral theology. They go straight for the structural foundation.
Right. They argue that the entire movement doesn't actually possess a comprehensive theology of its own, despite its massive volume of literature.
Exactly. The text distills it down to just two load-bearing pillars.
Okay, so what are these two pillars?
So the author claims that if you strip away all the pamphlets and the specific jurisprudential debates, the movement rests entirely on two things.
Right.
Pillar one is Mirza Ghulam Ahmad's personal claim to prophethood and divine revelation.
Okay, that makes sense for a religious movement. What is the second one?
Pillar two is the absolute abolition of jihad, specifically the concept of armed resistance, with the explicit goal of demanding complete Muslim submission to British colonial rule in India.
Wow. Okay, so framing the movement that way is a highly calculated rhetorical move by the author.
Oh, it is a brilliant structural move.
By reducing the theology to just those two specific pillars, the orthodox critique is telling its audience that this isn't just a deviation in how to interpret a verse.
Right, or how to pray.
Exactly. It is framing the movement as a politically weaponized entity.
The argument is that this wasn't an organic spiritual revival for the Muslims of India.
It was a pacification strategy.
Yeah, wrapped in religious vocabulary designed specifically to serve a foreign colonial power.
So the core thesis is basically, we aren't fighting a new religion, we are fighting a British pacification program.
Exactly. That is the baseline.
And once the author establishes those two pillars, they immediately bring out the sledgehammer for pillar number one.
They go right after his credibility.
Right. They attack Mirza Ghulam Ahmad's personal credibility, starting with a massive crisis of ancestry.
The source text points out that the founder had an incredibly fluid understanding of his own family tree.
Which is wild. Initially, his family claimed to be of proud Mughal descent.
Right, standard for the region and their social standing.
But then later, Mirza claimed a direct divine revelation stating his origins were actually Persian.
The author actually quotes the specific supposed divine message used to justify this sudden shift in bloodline.
What did it say?
Mirza claimed God revealed to him, "The ones who disbelieved, a man from Fars replied to them, 'May God thank his effort.'"
Fars referring to Persia.
Exactly.
Wait, but if someone is claiming to be receiving direct, infallible, literal instructions from the architect of the universe, how do you accidentally claim the wrong ancestors?
Right. It doesn't make any sense.
Like, how is your own grandfather's origin a point of contradiction?
Well, the Orthodox critique zeroes in on that exact cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, I would imagine.
The author uses this lineage shift as the first major structural crack in his claim to divine communication.
But there has to be a reason, right? Why change it to Persian specifically?
That is the key. You have to understand the theological weight of claiming Persian ancestry in this specific context.
Okay, break that down for me.
In Islamic tradition, there are historical and prophetic narrations specifically regarding a companion named Salman the Persian.
Right.
And there are prophecies about a man from Fars who would revive the faith when it was lost.
Ah, I see. So there is an existing prophetic mold just waiting to be filled.
Precisely. The Orthodox argument here hinges on the idea that Mirza saw these existing traditions.
And conveniently experienced a revelation.
Exactly, a revelation that retroactively changed his genetics from Mughal to Persian so he could step into that specific prophetic role.
That is quite the coincidence.
And the text points out that the shifting didn't even stop there.
Wait, really? He changed it again.
Yeah, at another point, he claimed his family was of Chinese origin.
Chinese.
To align with a different mystic's prophecy about a child born in China.
You have got to be kidding me.
Nope. And later, he even claimed direct descent from Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad.
So the author is essentially saying, look, God knows where your DNA comes from.
Right. God wouldn't be confused about this.
If your supposed revelations are constantly contradicting basic genetic reality to fit whatever prophecy is currently advantageous, then the source of those revelations is not divine.
It completely undermines the epistemological foundation of his claims.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because if the divine voice cannot accurately report his ancestry, how can it accurately report complex theology?
Right. And from this dismantling of his lineage, the critique moves seamlessly into an attack on his personal disposition.
The character assassination part of the text.
Yes. The author builds this massive case using Mirza's own published writings to argue that his behavior was entirely incompatible with the ontological reality of a prophet.
The specific language the text highlights is, well, it's jarring to read in a religious context.
It really is. The author meticulously catalogs the insults Mirza hurled at his theological opponents and Orthodox critics.
What kind of insults are we talking about here?
Well, he called them pigs, brain donkeys, dogs, clucking hens, effeminate men, and even compared them to dancing prostitutes.
Wow. Okay, so we really have to unpack the theological mechanism the author is employing by highlighting this vitriol.
Because it's not just about him being rude, right?
Exactly. In the Orthodox Islamic paradigm, prophethood isn't just a job title.
Right.
It comes with the concept of isma, which translates to divine protection and supreme moral elevation.
Okay, isma.
Yes. Prophets are required to be the ultimate paragons of patience, refined speech, and forbearance.
Especially when facing intense opposition.
Exactly. They are the structural role models for human behavior.
So the author is arguing that using this kind of incredibly crude, localized insult fundamentally breaks the definition of what a prophet is.
Right.
Like, a man speaking with the voice of the divine wouldn't resort to calling a rival scholar a clucking hen.
That is the exact jurisprudential argument. The text is establishing that his character falls objectively short of the minimum standard required for divine connection.
And the author doesn't just leave this in the realm of theological theory, do they?
No, they anchor this critique in a highly specific historical event where this vitriolic behavior had actual, tangible legal consequences.
The courtroom pledge.
Yes, this is a crazy detail.
The insults apparently got so aggressive and the public disruption so severe that a formal case was brought before a local British magistrate.
Right. The colonial authorities actually had to step in.
Yeah. Mirza was literally forced to stand in front of the deputy governor and sign a binding legal document promising to stop using foul language and publicly insulting his opponents.
It is a striking historical image that the author utilizes to maximum effect.
It is like a modern corporate CEO who goes around publishing books claiming to be an enlightened, transcendent visionary.
Right.
Someone who has unlocked the secrets of human consciousness. But then they get hit with a literal restraining order because they cannot stop throwing unhinged temper tantrums and cyberbullying their rivals on social media.
Yeah, that dissonance completely destroys the aura of authority.
Completely.
And the author uses that legal document as verifiable historical proof that his disposition was worldly, petty, and deeply flawed.
But the critique notes that the character flaws went far beyond insulting contemporary scholars, right?
Oh, much further. The text expresses profound theological outrage over Mirza's written claims regarding previous universally revered prophets.
Specifically Jesus.
Yes, specifically Jesus.
The text highlights that Mirza accused Jesus of being a drunkard, of having bad character, and even claimed Jesus had an inclination towards prostitutes due to his ancestry.
Which is an incredibly dangerous thing to say.
Right. Why would he write something so explosively controversial in an Islamic context where Jesus is highly revered?
The author's analysis of this is purely structural. Well, Mirza claimed the title of the promised Messiah.
Okay.
The Orthodox critique theorizes that in order to cement that title, Mirza realized he had to compete with the historical memory of the original Messiah.
Oh, I see.
So by deliberately tearing down the historical figure of Jesus, painting him as morally compromised, weak, and flawed, Mirza was attempting a theological zero-sum game.
He was trying to make his own claim to the messiahship look vastly superior by comparison.
Exactly.
It is basically a political smear campaign against a predecessor from 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, pretty much.
Like he is saying, you think you want the original Messiah to return? Look how flawed he was. You are much better off with me.
And from the perspective of this Orthodox critique, this is the absolute zenith of blasphemy.
It is an attack on the inviolable dignity of a recognized messenger of God.
Which, again, breaks the fundamental rules of how prophets operate in the Islamic paradigm. Prophets do not smear other prophets.
Right, so because Mirza's political alignment with the British was so violently rejected by the Orthodoxy, and his character was being publicly dismantled in court, the text argues his movement had to increasingly rely on the specific, undeniable nature of his revelations to maintain authority.
But this is where the source text takes us into some truly surreal territory.
Oh, it gets so weird here.
Yeah.
The author dissects the compilation of his claimed revelations, which is called the Tadkira,
and exposes them as linguistically and conceptually chaotic.
The text points out that these supposed divine messages were a multilingual blender.
They incorporated Arabic, Persian, Urdu, and English, often jumbled together without any coherent grammatical structure.
Right. The text highlights one specific English revelation Mirza claimed to receive.
Oh, the English one.
Yeah, the quote is, "I can what I will do."
I can what I will do.
The grammar is just incredibly awkward.
And that fundamentally breaks the Orthodox paradigm of revelation, which heavily emphasizes the linguistic perfection and absolute clarity of the divine word.
Right. God wouldn't struggle with English syntax.
Exactly. But the author goes beyond the grammar and focuses on the actual imagery Mirza used to describe the delivery mechanism of these messages.
Right. Mirza claimed the angel delivering these revelations looked like a young Englishman.
A young English clerk.
Sitting on a chair, speaking English.
It is just such a bizarre visual.
And in one specific interaction highlighted by the text, the English angel supposedly told Mirza, "You are very beautiful."
To which Mirza simply replied, yes.
Yes, just a yes.
The author highlights this bizarre, highly specific aesthetic to raise a fundamental question about the origin of these experiences.
Like, where is this actually coming from if it is not divine?
The critique explicitly theorizes that these visions were not divine, nor were they entirely fabricated out of thin air by Mirza.
This is where the critique genuinely surprised me. They are alleging actual 19th century colonial psychological warfare, right?
Yes. They suggest that British colonial agents may have been utilizing mesmerism, psychological manipulation, or early forms of hypnosis on Mirza.
Wow, that is quite the claim.
You have to keep in mind the historical context of the late 19th century.
Right.
Mesmerism and early psychological conditioning were areas of intense interest and experimentation for European powers.
Okay, so the text argues that Mirza, who may have had some psychological vulnerabilities, was placed in trance states by colonial handlers.
Yes. And when he was in this highly suggestible, altered state, hearing a young English colonial officer speaking to him in English, his influenced mind interpreted this human occupier as a divine angel delivering literal revelation.
That perfectly bridges the gap between his chaotic, localized visions and his extreme political subservience.
It connects the dots.
The author uses this hypnosis theory to argue that Mirza was either a willing, conscious asset of the British faking the visions, or he was a deeply deluded man whose psychological state was weaponized by the empire to construct a compliant theology.
And the author does not just float this theory in a vacuum.
They bring evidence.
Exactly. The critique moves immediately to provide concrete, historical documentation of Mirza's deep, self-proclaimed loyalty to the British crown to back up this assertion of colonial collaboration.
The receipts.
The receipts.
The text quotes extensively from a formal letter Mirza wrote directly to the British authorities.
This letter is incredible.
In it, he meticulously details his family's multi-generational loyalty to the empire. He specifically brags that his father provided 50 horsemen to assist the British in crushing the 1857 rebellion.
The 1857 rebellion is the ultimate political litmus test in this context.
Because it was the massive uprising against colonial rule, right?
Yeah, often called the First War of Independence, and it was heavily supported by the Muslim population.
So for Mirza to brag about providing cavalry to help the British slaughter his own countrymen who were fighting for independence, that is a profound, irreversible statement of allegiance to the occupier.
It is drawing an incredibly bright line in the sand.
And he goes further in the letter, doesn't he?
Oh, yeah. He apologizes that he personally cannot provide funding or horses to the British military, but he offers his pen in hand.
His pen in hand.
He boasts to the colonial government that he has written 50 cabinets worth of books aimed specifically at Arab lands and the Muslim world.
With one singular goal, right, to strictly forbid armed resistance or jihad against the British Empire.
The author of our source text frames this letter as the definitive smoking gun.
I mean, it is pretty damning.
The critique argues that this absolute pledge of loyalty proves the entire theological framework of the movement was reverse-engineered to serve the specific geopolitical needs of the British.
The theological argument the author makes here is actually profound.
How so?
Well, historically, true prophets emerge to challenge oppressive power structures, right?
Right.
Moses confronts Pharaoh.
Exactly.
They do not actively bless the occupying army and demand that the oppressed population submit to their colonizers as a matter of religious duty.
By using his claimed divine authority to protect the British military from resistance, the author argues Mirza proved he was a seedling nurtured by the colonial regime.
A theology of convenience.
Precisely. If you can convince a population that God himself wants them to be ruled by the British, the empire saves a fortune on troops and ammunition.
But promoting such an overtly pro-colonial, anti-resistance theology in late 19th century India created massive friction with the established Orthodox texts.
Because the existing Islamic prophecies regarding the end times and the return of figures like Jesus simply did not match Mirza or his political project.
Which forces the movement into what the author describes as intense linguistic gymnastics.
Oh, the textual reinterpretation part.
Yeah. The critique zeroes in on how the movement had to completely alter scriptural definitions to justify Mirza's claims.
For example, Orthodox texts clearly predict the return of the Son of Mary.
Right, and Mirza is not Jesus, the literal Son of Mary.
Obviously not.
So, the text notes, the movement argued that phrases like Son of Mary or Wife of Pharaoh in the scripture shouldn't be taken as literal historical figures.
They redefined them as descriptive metaphors.
Metaphor.
Yeah. They argued that Son of Mary simply refers to any pious believer who achieves a specific, elevated spiritual state.
Okay.
And since Mirza claimed to have achieved that state, he could metaphorically hold the title of the Son of Mary.
The author's counter-argument here is structural, and they mercilessly expose the epistemological danger of this approach.
Because it destroys the meaning of words.
Right. It is like someone rewriting the U.S. Constitution by claiming the word president is just a metaphor for anyone who feels like a strong leader, and Congress is just a metaphor for a group chat among friends.
That is the exact nature of the critique. The author argues that if you can take clear, historical, proper nouns from Scripture and arbitrarily redefine them as metaphors to suit your immediate political or theological needs, then the Scripture itself loses all structural integrity.
Right. With this logic, the author argues, you could redefine the specific physical acts of daily prayer or fasting as mere emotional metaphors.
Which some groups have done. But the orthodoxy sees this not as innovative interpretation, but as a deliberate destruction of the linguistic and legal boundaries of the faith.
So to counter this orthodox pushback and prove he actually had divine backing, Mirza leaned heavily into making highly specific public prophecies.
And the author gleefully catalogs how these prophecies spectacularly backfired,
creating a huge epistemological crisis for his followers.
Yes. The text details the saga of the Mohammadi Begum prophecy.
Oh, this story is wild.
It is presented as a profound, verifiable failure.
Tell us about it.
So Mirza claimed a direct guarantee from God that he would marry a specific woman named Mohammadi Begum.
Okay, a divine matchmaking claim.
Right. And he attached a highly specific timeline and consequence to this claim, publicly prophesying that if she married anyone else, her new husband would face divine wrath and die within 2.5 years.
He essentially put his entire prophetic credibility on a 30-month countdown clock regarding a specific marriage.
Yes, he really boxed himself in.
And according to the text, the outcome was a complete rejection.
She rejected him.
She married another man. That man lived a long, healthy life. And Mirza eventually died without ever marrying her.
The author uses Mirza's own previously published bravado against him.
Right, quoting his statement where he said, "If this doesn't happen, I am the most wicked of the wicked."
The author just lets Mirza's own established criteria for failure condemn him.
But the text culminates this section with an even more dramatic, fatal public failure.
The Mubahala.
Yes. In 1908, facing relentless opposition from Orthodox scholars, Mirza engaged in a traditional Mubahala with a prominent scholar named Sheikh Sanallah Amritsari.
We need to explain the mechanics of a Mubahala because it is intense.
Yeah, it is not just a debate.
No, it is a mutual prayer, a literal spiritual duel where two opposing parties publicly invoke the curse of God upon whoever is lying.
That is heavy.
It is an ancient concept, referencing the historical Mubahala of Najran. The specific condition laid out in this 1908 duel was that the liar would die during the lifetime of the truthful one.
It is the ultimate theological high-wire act.
You are asking for immediate, lethal divine intervention to settle a doctrinal dispute.
And the historical reality that the author highlights as the definitive, undeniable proof of Mirza's falsehood is the outcome of this challenge.
Right. What happened?
Mirza Ghulam Ahmad died shortly after issuing this Mubahala in 1908.
Wow. While his Orthodox opponent, Sheikh Sanallah Amritsari, lived on for decades.
Yes.
Decades. The text frames this not as a medical event or a coincidence, but as a literal divine execution.
Right. The author argues that God accepted the terms of the spiritual duel and struck down the deceiver.
So we have the shifting lineage.
The vitriolic character.
The bizarre English visions tied to colonial mesmerism.
The explicit political subservience.
The destruction of scriptural language.
And these highly public, fatal, failed prophecies. All of this architectural critique culminates in the final, most consequential segment of the source text.
This is where things get very real.
Because this is where the theological debate transitions into severe, real-world legal excommunication.
Because of everything the author just outlined, the Orthodox Islamic world reacted.
And they reacted by building an impenetrable legal fortress.
This final section is where the author proves that the rejection of this movement isn't just the opinion of one angry writer.
Right.
It is the codified, unanimous consensus of global Islamic jurisprudence.
The text meticulously outlines the issuance of fatwas, starting locally and expanding globally.
The text details that scholars in Amritsar and beyond issued strict rulings declaring believers of the Qadiyani movement to be complete apostates.
They are legally categorized as entirely outside the fold of Islam.
And the author outlines the incredibly severe societal mechanics of this apostasy designation.
It is not just a theological label, is it?
Not at all. It fundamentally severs the social contract.
Right. The jurisprudential weight of these rulings is absolute. The text provides specific examples of how this operates in Islamic family law.
Like marriage annulments.
Exactly. If a Muslim man converts to this movement, his marriage to a Muslim woman is instantly legally annulled.
It is called fasq.
Fasq. Okay, so the marriage contract is dissolved by the state or the religious authority.
Furthermore, the text points out that the man is legally required to pay the full dowry to the woman immediately.
And he completely loses all legal custody of his children.
He is socially and legally excised from the community structure.
Which raises a big question. Why did the scholars feel an existential need to employ such absolute severe legal mechanisms?
Why not just treat them as a misguided sect?
Exactly.
It is because of the specific nature of what Mirza claimed.
Right.
The orthodox argument here is that by claiming prophethood, Mirza violated the absolute load-bearing pillar of Islamic theology.
Which is the doctrine of Qadiyani and Nubuwah, the finality of prophethood.
Right. This doctrine states that Muhammad is the final prophet and no new prophets can come after him.
Why is that specific doctrine so structurally vital to the orthodoxy?
Because if the door to prophethood is left open, then the door to altering divine law is left open.
Ah, I see.
If a new prophet can arrive, they can change the rules of prayer.
They can abolish jihad to serve the British.
They can redefine the entire religion.
Right.
Khatma Nubuwah is the constitutional bedrock that ensures the religion is complete and tamper-proof.
So by claiming prophethood, Mirza wasn't just interpreting the law differently.
He was claiming the authority to rewrite the Constitution.
The scholars cited in the text viewed this as a structural attempt to dismantle Islam from the inside out.
Which, in their view, necessitated total excommunication.
And the author demonstrates how that local excommunication eventually evolved into state law and global consensus.
The very end of the text lists the massive institutional rulings to prove the finality of this judgment.
Right. The text highlights the 1974 unanimous decision by the Pakistani parliament.
Which is a watershed historical moment.
Absolutely. You have an entire nation-state, after extensive theological and legal debate on the parliament floor, utilizing the mechanisms of state power to officially, constitutionally define the movement as a non-Muslim minority.
It is unprecedented.
The text also cites the declarations from the Muslim World League in Mecca in the Islamic year 1394 AH, cementing this exclusion across the global Orthodox community.
The author essentially drops the microphone at the end of the book.
Yeah, they really do, stating that the debate is over.
From the local scholars who witnessed his life, to the National Parliament of Pakistan, to the highest religious authorities in Mecca, the consensus is absolute.
The author uses these global institutional rulings as the ultimate validation of their critique.
It proves that the entire Orthodox world examined the shifting lineage, the colonial loyalty, and the theological claims, and uniformly arrived at the exact same conclusion.
It is an incredibly intense, systematic dismantling.
Right, really.
So as we wrap up our analysis of this text's final synthesis, what is the core architectural insight here?
What should the listener take away from all this?
Yeah, what should you be mulling over after navigating this massive critique?
Well, if we abstract the specific theological arguments of this text, it provides a profoundly revealing case study into the mechanics of religious schisms.
And the intersection of faith and geopolitics.
Exactly. It forces us to examine the nature of new religious movements that emerge under the shadow of intense political occupation.
The enduring question this critique raises is, how do we untangle genuine spiritual interpretation from the desperate, calculated political needs of a colonizing power?
It asks us to consider how much of the religious history and sectarian divides we observe today were actually shaped, funded, or encouraged by the invisible hand of empire seeking to pacify a population.
It completely reframes how you look at the origins of doctrinal disputes.
It really makes you second-guess the history.
We started this deep dive looking for a clean X-ray of a theological debate. But the closer we examined the author's arguments, the more we realized we were navigating the complex, murky depths of human psychology, colonial survival, and the structural limits of religious law.
It is a lot to think about.
It definitely is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Keep questioning the historical narratives you take for granted.
Keep looking for the hidden architecture behind the arguments, and we'll catch you next time.